Okay, welcome everybody. So as I was saying, Gilson, Chapter 3, Essence and Existence. So there's two minor and three main characters in this chapter. The main characters are Avicenna, um, Scotus, and Suarez. And Avicenna is kind of presented as kind of the background to um, uh, the two scholastics, who we can think of as they're actually a little bit after Aquinas, but they're sort of the scholastic rivals to Aquinas on this question of being in essence, or essence in existence. Um, so one of the things to notice in this chapter is that we got a bunch of stuff that's Gilson himself kind of laying out his position, especially in the ways he disagrees with Scotus and Suarez. And we're not really going to see all of his motivations for doing that until the next chapter. But he's what's the point? The point is you gotta pay attention here to where Gilson is disagreeing with the people he's trying to explain to you, right? So you got to separate the position of the philosophers he's talking about from his own, and understand their positions the way they understand them first, and then only then notice his criticisms of them. So that's one of the challenges of this chapter, just to disentangle the places where he's being fair. Joe, go ahead, Joe.
Are you saying, therefore, that so-called his position, when he disagrees with Suarez, disagrees with Scotus, that he is actually voicing the view of Thomas, because you said earlier that he's a Thomist, and therefore I would think all his criticism come out from that perspective.
So mostly so, but not simply the way Thomas probably would understand himself. He's someone who has got a later view of Thomism, which might not be exactly the same motivations as Aquinas himself. In part, it's motivated by things which happen around the time of Hume and Kant and so forth, as will come out in the next chapter. But so yes, he's contrasting their position with his own position. His own position is mostly Thomist, but it's his own particular take on Thomism, if I can put it that way. And is all of that already there in original Aquinas? Not obviously. Partly it's a rereading that thinks like the Thomas road not taken was the right road, for reasons which became apparent later after Kant, something like that. So there's an element of revisionism in Gilson's own position and his own reasons for favoring Aquinas. From the standpoint of people like Scotus and Suarez, they have Aquinas in front of them, and they've understood his doctrine, and they think they're doing it justice when they, take it this or that seriously, but don't simply agree with it entirely. It's also not obvious that the Thomism that we get from Gilson is exactly what it was in Aquinas himself. That is unclear how revisionist and how faithful his understanding of Aquinas is himself. But certainly people like Scotus and Suarez were not trying to be dismissive of Thomism. They thought they were taking it seriously and incorporating what it had to teach them, but they weren't simply agreeing with it. And Gilson thinks that they missed the point of Thomism, right, on the specific question of existence. But some of his reasons for thinking that only come out, after Kant, so to speak, which obviously Suarez and Scotus weren't thinking about at all, right? They weren't thinking about how if you have an entirely essence-based notion of being, you will be vulnerable to a certain argument against ontological proofs in Kant, right? Gilson is thinking that if you take this position, then this later argument knocks down your whole house of cards. So I don't want to take that position because this later argument is out there in the wings, ready to knock over your tower, right? So in part, Gilson is maneuvering many of the concerns and conclusions of scholasticism around later arguments against them. And he, since as we'll see in the next chapter, a lot of the position that Kant is assailing is pretty close to Suarez, in the sense that it's Christian Wolff's philosophy, which is reasonably indebted to Suarez and Scotus. If Kant is ready to knock that whole position over, it's not where you want to put all of your eggs, if I can put it that way. Anyway, so there's that kind of dynamic that only sort of comes out in the next chapter. What's going on here is he's considering this serious sort of, if I put it this way, peak of scholasticism that isn't Aquinas, rivals to Aquinas. And Gilson is trying to point out his reasons, Gilson's reasons for disagreeing with them, or the things he thinks that they miss, or the ways he thinks they're inadequate. But much of that comes down to his own fundamental philosophical position himself, and his reasons for that position have not all been revealed yet, right? There's some of them have to do with later parts of the history than we've already seen. Another way of putting that is that it's not obvious that he's being entirely just to Suarez and Scotus here, right? But because he knows them well, there's a great thing about this chapter. You learn the positions of Avicenna, Scotus, and Suarez in a pretty condensed form in the course of him disagreeing with them. He has at least this in common with many of the other good scholastics like Suarez, that he will state the opponent's position pretty fairly in order to argue with it. How fairly we'll have to disentangle as we go through the chapter. But the fundamental thing to think here is that there is a fully developed, almost consensus position of most of scholasticism coming out of the Middle Ages that Gilson himself disagrees with. But that's the position that you find in the tradition that's covered in this chapter. The tradition from Avicenna through Scotus to Suarez is in a way the dominant scholastic tradition. It's not the position of people who are sort of outside critics of that, like William of Ockham. And from Gilson's point of view, it's also not the position of Aquinas. But it is the position of much of medieval Islamic philosophy more than theology, and much of scholastic philosophy, and much of sort of mainline Christian Western theology before the Reformation, something like that. And the thing to understand there is it's true that Aquinas kind of made Aristotle safe for the church and got Aristotle accepted into Catholicism in the West, but it was also subject to some of the condemnations of 1277, as we talked about last time. We'll get to that more here again. And people like Scotus and Suarez were considerably more acceptable to the theologians of the hierarchy in the West, so to speak. Aquinas wasn't a completely dominant kind of philosophical position in Catholicism, anything like that, until really the 19th century. It's early 19th century popes who were very taken with Aquinas and thinks he got everything right, that raise Aquinas to the status of like the Catholic theologian, right? Whereas earlier than that, he was one very respected one. Yes, he kind of represented the position of his order, right? He was associated with the Benedictines, but not of all Christian theology in the West, if that makes sense. Okay, good question. I want to get first reactions to the whole chapter before we get into the details of each of these people. But first, just Alex, you want to give us your first reactions to the chapter and what you saw in it, or especially things which either you particularly liked or problems you want to make sure we cover?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I found it was a helpful chapter for me overall. I guess what stands out, I think I have a better appreciation of what essentialism is and how to understand that in contrast to, what existence would be. That contrast is slightly clearer to me. I found the text itself to be a bit rambling. There's quite a bit of repetition, and the thing that Jason, you were talking about, he has an agenda. It's not a textbook.
Yep.
Right. So that stood out In terms of questions, yeah, the thing that's I was trying to understand in the position of Duns Scotus, how exactly it is that we can understand the existence of something as its complete determination. So the story seems to be that, you know, we have essences, they're somehow created by God as these creables, I think. And then just the complete determination of the concept makes a thing to be, right? And I guess that's what essentialism is. And I'm trying to understand, and this term was used that I've seen before, Hexeity, I think it is. And
Thisness,
yeah, just exactly
basically.
what that is. And
yep.
Yeah.
So one thing which is useful to understand here is there's things going in here back to Avicenna, and some of these things are a little bit different in the Arabic than they are in the Latin. The fact that you've gone through the Arabs means that some of the original Greek terms that were sort of Greek technical terms were kind of reinterpreted in ways that are closer to the constructs that are natural in Arabic. And then from that, you get Latin versions of those, which are seeing the Arabic alongside seeing the Greek, and they come up with a Latin technical terminology for these distinctions that is indebted to both. And that's clearly going on with thisness in Scotus. So in Arabic, the being in the sense of that a thing is really something very much like thatness, right? You're using the things which are we would think of as the kinds of things that the kinds of questions that can be answered by the thing turned into an isness is what you get in Arabic. So the existence to Avicenna is the thatness of a thing. The essence is the thisness of a thing, and the individuality is the he-ness of a thing. The third person particle, he, she, it, right? Isness of something, it is what gets translated as identity. So the predecessor of the thisness of Duns Scotus is the itness or he-ness of Avicenna. So the essence answers the question of what a thing is. It answers the what question because it is the this of the thing. And the existence question to Avicenna answers the that question. That the thing is. Existence is that the thing is. It's the thatness of the thing. It's almost literally a that-ishness is kind of what the term is in Arabic for that gets translated as existence. And then this third thing that you find in Avicenna is the he-ness or itness of the thing. And the he-ness or itness of the thing is what gets translated as identity. So the notion is you both have the essence of what the thing is, but that's the same across all the copies or instances of it. The Toyota Camry of the thing is the thisness of the thing, right? The thatness of the thing is whether or not you have an actual Toyota Camry or only an idea of it, only the blueprints or a plan of a Toyota Camry. If you have an actual Toyota Camry, there is a thatness which is also found, right? But there's a third thing. The third thing is this particular Toyota Camry, and that has the he, she, itness that isn't just the thatness that's shared across all the actuals, and it isn't just the thisness that's shared across all the instances as the same definition. It's the this particularity of it. It's the he, she, it of it. It's which person. It's not answering the question of what or answering the question of that. It's answering the question in Arabic of who, right? Where that who doesn't necessarily mean person because it includes its, The who is the thing that is designated by the numerical identity of the thing. Which one? So the which one of it across all of its possible instances or all of its actual instances is the he, she, or itness of the thing, the he-ness of the thing, and that becomes the Duns-Scotian thisness. And for him, it's thisness where the thisness is no longer meaning the what it is. It's no longer meaning the essence. It's the identity. It's the individuality of this particular one. So the hakitas, or thisness of the thing, is the which particular instance, the which particular one, right? Of the many things that maybe fall under that definition, which particular one are you talking about? And in the machinery of Avicenna, that thisness, right, is something which can itself have thatness truly predicated of it or thatness truly denied of it, right? Socrates is no more. Socrates is not just a definition of Athenian philosopher, because there are other Athenian philosophers like Aristotle, right? He is this particular Athenian philosopher. There is a thisness about Socrates. But in the time when he was alive, that thisness also had the thatness of being a present, instantiated particular, and it no longer does, right? So in Avicenna's machinery, right, the Athenian philosopher is a definition that may be shared across instances. The thisness, or the he-ness of Socrates, is who, which particular under that definition. And the existence, or thatness, is something more like is the Athenian philosopher that is this particular Athenian philosopher, this individual Athenian philosopher, this who, is it actual? Is it in existence? Or is it only a possible? And that last question may be something whose answer, right, varies with time, right? They're finite in time beings, the finite particulars. So their thatness turns on and off, so to speak.
And so the thatness, could we also say the thatness, so the second term out of the three, that one would be also shared by all the.
So in some sense,
instances.
thatness is shared by everything that is, and it's the same thatness that is or is not. So the famous doctrine of Avicenna, which is that existence is an accident to the essence, by which, as Gilson correctly points out, he means it is something that befalls the essence. It happens to it, right? It happens to be that this essence exists, right? So that's the notion of the accidentality of existence to the finite existence in Avicenna. Now, partly that's because Avicenna has one necessary existent, God, that is something like being itself, and all of the particulars, all of the finite creables, all of the finite elements of creation are only through another. They are through their cause. You can say they are ontologically supported by being itself. That which is currently supported by being itself is that of which thatness can be properly predicated now, right? And that is an accident befalling not only that essence, but that essence along with its who-ness of which one, right? Socrates is no longer, there might be an Athenian philosopher now, but it's not Socrates. And partly, Gilson is right that there's a kind of fundamental essentialism in Avicenna, and he kind of misses how much that extends, although in other places he sort of gets at it. He talks about interpreters of Avicenna who extended that essentiality to God, which he says Avicenna was careful to exclude from it. But what's really going on is something more like, for Avicenna, God is the actual essence, existence. So it's not just that it's the concept of existence, because he's adding the fact that it's actual, but it is as general as being itself, right? Just as for Avicenna, the horse is only horseness, as we learn, right? Not one individual horse, nor the many possible horses. It's not one or many itself, it's just horseness. To Avicenna, God is only being. So in that sense, God is only being, God is the necessary being, God is being itself, are to Avicenna equivalent statements. He's thinking of God as something like the concept of being and the generality of being, but not just as a concept, but as the actual existent thing that the concept is trying to refer to, right? Infinite being tout court, necessary being that always is his God concept, or his God definition. And in that sense, it fits entirely within his order of everything having an essence. It's just that God is that particular, or that delimited, conceptually delimited, whose essence is that it exists, right? Its essence is its existence because it is being, right? So that's the God concept in Avicenna. It's something like being itself. And that means that, first of all, that's the only thing which you can unequivocally say that it is. And second of all, every other thing which you can say that it is gets its that it is from that, because that's the generality of it. This is why Avicenna was sometimes accused by some of the Muslim theologians of a kind of pantheism, because he's making everything that is directly supported by the being of God. He quotes the part that Avicenna points to in the Quran to give that a sort of scriptural Islamic support. Everything is perishable except his face, right? The idea there is something like when the face of being is turned towards something, it is. When the face of being is not towards something, it is not. Face is just idea in Greek. Idea is just Greek for face. So what Avicenna is noticing is that the doctrine of ideas and the doctrine of the face of God can be correlated to one another. Participation in being and God turning his face towards something are practically the same words. So that's the sort of I don't know if it's a coincidence. That's the confluence that he's noticing, right? Is that to exist, to participate in being, to share in the idea of being, to have the outward aspect of being about you, to have the face of Godness, right? Or the face of beingness are the same. Participation in being supported by the face of God are the same thing. So that's his doctrine of being. His doctrine of being is that being in the tout court sense, being entire, so to speak, is the concept of being, is God. And all the beings less than the infinite, therefore more particular than that, have their being through their cause, in the sense that their thatness is supported by their participation in the thatness of thatness entire, or being itself. Okay, so that's the sense in which to be and to participate in God are synonymous. Now, there are some people that understood that as a kind of idealism, that it was the beings or the thoughts of God idealism version of these things, so that the support that something has to be is that it is a thought of God. And that is particularly easy for someone who thinks that essences are thought-like. They want to think of essences and thoughts as being correlate terms. then you need some mind that's doing the thinking of this essential thing. So that the idea is that when you think about something, you're just trying to understand a finite external thing. When God thinks about something, he's conferring being upon it, right? Because it exists as a thought in the mind of God. That's a way of trying to capture the mind-likeness of essences by giving them a mind that they can exist in, as well as understand the being-likeness of God as it's that special mind in which to be thought and to be are equivalent. Takes us all the way back to the Platonic notion that being and thinking are the same. The being and thinking that are the same in Avicenna are being and the thinking of God. Okay, so that's just explaining the machinery of thatness, whatness, and he-ness or who-ness that you get in Avicenna. And the point I was making with the translation is that the term that is being translated as the thatness there, which later becomes the notion of existence, is really just thatness in Arabic. And this is how they translate the Greek word on, or the Greek word ousia, right? So they translate the Greek word being as thatness. Okay, so does that help?
Yeah, it does. I guess what you were talking about with that three-way distinction is the point that Gilson makes about the essences being existentially neutral, and then for Avicenna, and
Yes.
then there is a form of universality, which is what it means for an essence to be thought in a mind. There is also a form of individuality, which is what it means for it to exist.
Not quite, because the universality or the individuality, right, can occur as intended in either register, right? You can intend the concept of all the Nissan Sentras, right? You can also intend the concept of this particular Nissan Sentra. Those are two different intentions, and those two different intentions can occur even in the mind. So the mind version of essences and the exterior pattern and things versions of essences both can take on any number, right? What Avicenna is trying to do in the terms of later logic is to take the things we would call existential quantifiers, the backward z of there exists, or the one, or the four everys, take those generalizations and pull them away from the essence to which they apply. He wants the essence and the quantification to be two distinct things, because previously there was a tendency to conflate them and to think that the existence thing and the oneness of the there is a single one of this backwards e, to equate those two things and to say that it was the ones that you were predicating existence of and not the universals. And then there was a question of, well, then what are the universals, right? But he wants to separate the quantification of is it all of them? Is it one of them? All of that has to be separated from the thing that you're trying to talk about. The thing you're trying to talk about is hoarseness itself, just the concept. We would say just the concept, just the essence, he would say, because it's not only mental. He wants to sharply distinguish he's not saying just the concept, because he's not implying that it's a purely mental thing. But just the essence can have any quantification put over it, right? It can be a universal or it can be singular. In itself, it's neither one. The hoarseness in the individual horse is not universal. The hoarseness in the universal is what makes it be a horse. Whatever pattern or configuration of DNA and molecules instantiates hoarseness here, right? It's making that horse be horse. And in that case, it's making an individual horse be this horse, right? But the hoarseness that's doing that to that individual is getting the individuality from the thing it's doing it in, this particular. It's not part of the hoarseness itself, right? The reason we can see the same hoarseness across multiple horses is because it's the same essence doing it to all of those horses, right? It's the same pattern.
Right. So I guess one consequence of this would be that, so with this separation of the essence from the quantity, it seems that the quantity then is aligned with existence. And
Can be.
And it's so.
But it can also be
Right.
abstract. It can also be abstract, right? Because existence is
Okay.
trying to be something concrete, and the number can be abstract. It could just be, you know, take the example of not hoarseness but animal, right? Can you meet animal in the street? You can't meet an animal that isn't one of the particular kinds of animal that is less than the entire kingdom of Animalia. There are no individual particular instances of Animalia as such, right? So these conceptual subsettednesses, right, work easily in the realm of the mental and the abstract, but all of these essential philosophers are trying to save that as also working in the actual external patterns and things. They don't want that degree of abstraction to mean unreality or only existing in a mind, right? It's a real shared fact about the patterns in all the actual animals that is animality, right? And animality itself doesn't have singularity or universality to it. Now, there's some other philosophers would say, oh, of course, animality always has universality about it because there's no instances of it as a particular thing. But it's still a particular thing compared to the living, non-living distinction, right? It's a particular thing within the living side of that distinction. So you can have all of these different powers of different subsets in mental operation terms of essences, but none of them, in terms of what they denote, imply anything about how many or singular those things are, right? All of that is exterior to the essence itself. The essence itself is just the definition. It's just the definition and whatever instances fall under that definition, right? So that's what he's trying to mean by hoarseness, right? Hoarseness is just hoarseness, and it's not a horse. It's not the idea of horse. It's not mentalized. It's not universal. It's not particular. It's just hoarseness. So he's trying to separate it out that way so that it can become the logical atom to which these other operators can apply, like instantiation, thatness, as a backwards E applied to the we would call the concept, right? And this was immensely influential because it's great for clearing up logic, right? Modern nominalist logicians will think about these things as being purely conceptual, and they're not trying to keep the way in which these things have to also still refer to actual external patterns and things. They kind of give up on that, right? They don't worry about that. But for the actual just sort of logical conceptual machinery, there's no question that it's all cleaner and works better if you're not thinking that claims about existence and claims about number are following each of these things around as you try to predicate about it, right? When I'm saying in the middle of a theorem inside some giant, if-then clause, right? I say, there exists an epsilon, right? I'm not trying to tell you there's exactly one and not another one. And I'm not trying to tell you how universal it is. And I'm not trying to tell you whether or not it exists in time in the material world. I'm just trying to tell you in this whole tissue of conceptual machinery, you're now supposed to consider, one particular epsilon, right? I need you to mentally instantiate it in your mind to follow the chain of thought I'm on, even if you think of the whole thing as just a train of thought, right? So I want to be able to write that as just backwards E epsilon, right? Where I'm not making a statement about it being in time or it being singular, but I want you to keep that epsilon separated from the quantification claims I make about it. Now, obviously, he's not using that whole machinery, but he's kind of at the beginning of that essentiality separation happening, so to speak. His hoarseness itself is separating the we would say the conceptual atom from any implications of number or existence that might be stemming from its cupola, right? The sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees. I'm not trying to say in that is that it happened yesterday, that it exists in time, that there's only one of them, right? I'm not doing anything about that. I'm moving entirely in a concatenation of concepts kind of essential realm, right? So as a matter of just sort of logic and clarity of thinking, that's all immensely useful, right? The thing which is different from modern logic in it is it's still trying to keep all of these hooks out to the things that it's referring to, right? None of these essences that he's talking about are meant to be purely mental acts. They're not meant to be purely mental operations. They're supposed to still also be the external patterns and things that you're referring to. They're supposed to be both at the same time, because that's what our notions of essences were supposed to explain to us, how correct understanding of realities are possible. And they do so by telling us that the external patterns and things and our definitions of things coincide, right? That's what essentialism, so to speak, is. It's the idea that our conceptual definitions of things and the actual external patterns and things coincide, are one-to-one and onto with one another if we've got the right definition, so that we can reason about our concepts of the thing in ways that will be true of the things themselves. Okay. So this is related to that, the first place where Gilson is brought up short by Avicenna, where Avicenna says, he says, essences are thoughts in minds, or they're patterns in things, and therefore they are also the thing which is true of, which is neither of those things, right? The purely abstract one. Gilson says, at first sight, this seems clear and exhaustive. On closer inspection, it's very curious. The first thing he tells us that essences are either in themselves or in the mind. Then he goes on to say that the essences can be considered either in things or in the mind or in themselves, right? So they're either in minds or in things, and therefore they're either in minds or in things or in themselves. And the reason that brings Gilson up short is Gilson himself doesn't think that they can be in themselves. He's not a Platonist, right? And his Aristotelianism and his existentialism in this sense are committed to the proposition that there are no essences in themselves. Essences in minds, that's fine. They have existential support from the minds in which they exist as thoughts. Essences as patterns and things, that's fine. They have existential support from the actual existing things in which they are merely arrangements and patterns. But to Gilson, essences only subsist. They don't exist. They're not real. They need something else in order to be. They need some substrate in order to be, and that substrate has to actually exist. It's either a mind that is thinking about them, and then their essences are just thoughts and abstractions, or it's some real particular in which they are an essential pattern that a mind can see, right? But that's kind of abstracted out of the existence supporting it. So Gilson is realist enough that he doesn't want to think that essences can be anything without the support of either a mind or an actual existing thing in which they are as a pattern. And so when Avicenna starts from these sort of two notions of what an essence is or what an idea is, and immediately says, therefore we have to consider them in themselves as a thing which is both of these things at once that lets them communicate, Avicenna is just going over the ground that motivated Plato to invent the idea of ideas in the first place, right? Avicenna is recapitulating Platonism there. But it's precisely the Platonism that Gilson is not willing to sign off on. It's exactly the bit of Platonism that Gilson thinks Plato got wrong and Aristotle was right to criticize him for, because he couldn't answer the question where these abstract ideas are. The right answer to the question of where the abstract ideas are might be, it's not aware, silly. It's off in the Platonic realm of truth or mathematical truth or something. It's, you know, in an eternity outside time where facts about mathematics exist, something like that. But that realm is exactly what the empiricism and materialism and realism, if you want to put it that way, of Gilson, he doesn't want to concede, so to speak. He's got reasons that we'll get to, you know, in the next chapter for that. But fundamentally, Gilson wants essences to be thought-like abstractions, and in that sense, not entirely real. When they're real, their support is a mind thinking them, or a mind noticing them as a pattern in something else. But both of them require an existing mind or an existing thing that's supporting that pattern to be real. Okay, and that's his fundamental disagreement with everybody in this chapter. None of the other people in this chapter think that. All the other people in this chapter are Platonists on the point. All the other people in this chapter think that essences are real. They don't necessarily think that essences are actual. And when we get to the later guys like Suarez wants the work that Gilson / Aquinas have existence doing to be performed by the notion of actuality instead. So for Suarez, you can certainly have an essence which isn't actual, right? And you can he's even willing to go as far as to agree with Gilson that of something which is merely possible, an essence which is merely possible and isn't actual, you can even say that it isn't. You can even say that it's nothing. But all he thinks you need to add to it in order for it to be a full-fledged existing concrete being is that it exists in act, that it be actual. So everything that Avicenna gets from thatness and everything that Gilson wants to get from existence, Suarez just wants to get from the concept of actuality, right? And this is a problem for Gilson because Gilson doesn't treat actuality as a term of distinction. He thinks there's nothing without actual support. The non-actual is only abstract. The non-actual isn't, seriously speaking. He doesn't use actual as a term of distinction the way that all these other Platonists do. So that's the fun when he talks about later, when he's talking about Suarez, and he says, at this point, we're marking time, and you just get to the point in a conversation where you have to say to someone, "Do you see it? No. Look again. Do you see it now? No." Right? And the point there is that the place where they're disagreeing is whether or not essences are real, but actuality is a term of distinction, and not everything that is actual. That's the kind of Platonist position of all the people in this chapter that he's arguing against. Versus Gilson's position, which is nothing is real unless it has actual existent support. And the things that you're calling real essences are just thoughts and just abstractions. And those thoughts and abstractions are not only actual, they're only real if they have an actual existent support of either a mind or an existing thing. So for Gilson, real existence is the brass tacks ontological support of anything thought-like. And the thought-like things in themselves just are nothing until they have such a real existent support. Okay. So in a way, if there's a talking past each other in this chapter, it's that. And in all of that, I think that it's fair to say Gilson can see the ways in which these people are too Platonist for him and are not agreeing with him. I don't think he can quite see things their way. I don't think he can quite see that for Suarez, for example, actuality is performing all the work that Gilson expects existence to perform. And it's just because for Suarez, actuality is a term of distinctions. There's only a limited subset of real things are actual, because for Suarez, reality is this big of all the truths of mathematics, all the truths outside of time. It's this enormous thing. And actuality is this tiny little subset of those things that happen to actually transpire in actual time, right? And are actual now even, right? So that the actual is a proper subset of the real. And this throws Gilson, right? At the end of the chapter, he's, criticizing a follower of Suarez for speaking about things in those terms. And it's like he wants to talk about things for whom it is accidental whether or not they exist. And why is Gilson, shocked at this? Because for Gilson, something which does not exist is something you don't even need to talk about, right? It doesn't exist. It's nothing. And that's the way he thinks of the entire category of what to the Suarezians and the Avicennians and the Scotians are the whole realm of the real and possible, but not currently actual. So at the end at 106, right, wherein he triumphantly concludes, thus and only thus can those finite and created things to which existence is not essential become the object of science. And just to a Suarezian, that's a perfectly sensible comment, right? Finite and created things to which existence is not essential means that it is not essential to them that they be actual. It's only possible that they be actual, right? And he wants it to be wants there to be science, reasoning, and knowledge about finite, created, merely possible things to which existence is not necessary. Actuality is not necessary. They're only actual at certain places and times, certain ways. But what jars to Gilson in that is he's talking about trying to have knowledge of finite created things that don't exist. Because when he hears existence is not essential, he's hearing don't exist. He's hearing aren't real. Because he's not employing actuality as a term of distinction. Go ahead, Joe. Joe, you're on mute.
Just crossing my mind is the idea. Okay, what would you? How would these guys categorize something like a quark, which was very much, or the Higgs? Let me call it a Higgs boson, which was very much seemed to be an anchored element in physics, but nobody could ever find it until very recently. And they found it, I don't even know how they found it, but the point remains that now they say it exists. What's going on here? How are they moving among these realms, but in which thing would things fit?
So, I mean, from the standpoint of that theory, it was something needed for the consistency of the theory, and all of the essentialist Platonists in that would think that they were understanding the actual conceptual machinery behind the world, and therefore they were positing that this extra piece of that machinery had to be there because it was essentially necessary for it, right? And using such essential necessity arguments to predict existent things, they regard as a matter of course. From the standpoint of existence, whether or not the theory is worth anything is going to be tested by whether or not actual existence supports the theory or not, right? So the empiricists are going to throw away all of that physical theory unless the boson is found, right? And they think that the boson doesn't exist unless material reality supports it, right? From their point of view, the Higgs boson was only real when it performed whatever acts it performed in the actual sequence of events in the experiment when it was detected. That at least is when we knew that it was real. But for them, it wasn't real unless that happened. It was just an abstraction.
And was it sufficient that it happened only once in their observation of it? Or
I don't think any of them are caring about that. The point is that some of this is going to get into differences of methodology and differences of epistemology of how you know things and when you know things and so forth. But none of that is about the things that are being known, right? Once you have an actual observation that corresponds to it, right? It's easy to get any one of these theories to take it into account, right? It's when it's only a mathematical abstraction that makes the world work, right? That the Platonist is happily going to ascribe actual being to it, right? And the Gilson-like existential or Humean skeptic empiricist person isn't, right? Now, the Humean skeptic might not, even after you have the observation, because there's other problems that he has with the chains of deductive reasoning you use to get your observations to link up to your theory, but that's a different story. But a epistemological story, where the Humeans and Popperians will go out at hammer and tongs. But neither of these people are fundamentally talking about questions about observation method, right? They're fundamentally talking about how the machinery of the world works, in the sense of not in our thoughts about it, but in the things that our thoughts are trying to refer to, what actually supports what, and what is the underlying, and what is the real, right? And Gilson has a tendency to downgrade anything essential by thinking of it as within the category of thought. And he thinks of thought as a kind of pale mirrored map of the real things. And the real things and the actual things almost are identical to him. So you'll find lots of places where he's almost conflating real and actual, right? And he'll use the word concrete when he's trying to mean both at once. He'll talk about concrete being, right, or a concrete thing. But you have to pay careful attention to where he slips somebody else's meaning and forces somebody else to equate real and actual when the other person might distinguish them. When Suarez calls something an actual essence, right, he's not using the actual as an empty amplifier, right? It's a critical term in a molecular pair. There are plenty of essences for Suarez that aren't actual. When you make it actual, right, you're talking about something else. You're talking about something that has already been actualized, an already actualized essence. And for Suarez, an already actualized essence is a concrete being, right? It's the full existent thing. And so he wants to say that actualization does everything that Gilson wants existence to do. So there's a revealing passage where Gilson explains his objection to this. He says, you know, your unrealized essence before it's actual is supposedly a mere nothing, a mere possible, and as a possible that isn't yet anything actual, it's a nothing. What are you going to get when you actualize that nothing? Nothing. So the way to think about this is, because he's thinking of the, oh, there's another revealing thing. Gilson also says that when they're merely possible essences, of course they already have an actuality. They're actual as essences. We think about them. Their support in that is they're a thought. That's an actual thought. It's not a merely possible thought. The merely possible essence is, to Gilson, already actual as a thought, right? This is why I say he's not employing actual as a term of distinction, because of all the things which Suarez is insisting to are merely possible. Gilson says, yeah, but they're already actual too. They're just actual as thoughts, not as existent realities. Now, to Suarez, this is a misunderstanding. He thinks you're misunderstanding the thing I'm trying to get my concepts to refer to, the external thing, with the psychological interior of me doing the referring. And to Suarez, that's just a logical mistake. It's almost a logical no-no, right? You're not allowed to turn the things I'm trying to get my words to refer to into my acts of referring. That's psychologism, so to speak, right? You're not letting me use my concepts the way I intended them to refer to what I wanted to be exterior things. So when Suarez says that a certain thing is only a possible, it's an essence which is only possible, he's not saying it's an actual thought in my head. He's saying it's not actual at all. It's at this point only possible. And that's why when he adds actuality to it, he thinks he is fundamentally changing what it is, right? He's made it an actual essence. And to him, an actual essence is doing all the same things that Gilson wants an existent to do. He's just added the actuality operator to it, and that has dropped it down into particularity and time. It's made it into an instance which actually occurs at an actual time. And he thinks that's all you're getting from existence. So why do I need the concept of existence when I already have the concept of actuality? Right? It's a superfluous addition. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I think part of the difficulty in the chapter, I think, Jason, we talked about that already. I guess that in a sense, like the main idea is not yet on the table for Gilson, which would be what existence is. And I guess that will come in the next chapter or further in the book, I imagine. I'm trying to understand, like, what is at stake in this debate? And I wonder if it's something like this, that, so we saw, I think it was in the previous chapter, that when he was discussing Aristotle, we came to this notion of I think he called it the individuality or the thisness, the aspect of something that actually cannot be defined. And it's, and that's existence seemed to be that, it's a certain act, but it's not the kind of thing you express in a definition by genus and specific difference, right? It's something else. And it seems like the only, to my mind at least, the only alternative is, well, it seems to be the kind of thing you just kind of bump up against. Like that's the existence, like kind of maybe the resistance of things, this kind of brute thatness.
Right.
Things
So
just are there.
This is what's going to get talked about in the next chapter as the givenness of things, right?
Right.
And it's the kind of thing that Heidegger talks about as facticity, right? So sort of a brute givenness. And the place that's going to come up for Gilson is in Hume's criticism of essentiality, right? If all the stuff we're talking about here is essentiality, right? Or rational essentiality, something like that, Hume is going to have a skeptical objection to it from an empiricist point of view, right? Where he's going to say, well, you've got all this tissue of logical connections between things that you're imagining, but what you actually experience empirically is this pure given, brute fact thisness, and this other given brute fact thisness, with no connection between them whatsoever. So all the connections that you're imputing as being there between the things, I, Hume, accuse you of gratuitously adding yourself. I claim that they aren't there in the experience. That's going to be Hume's skeptical dynamite attack on essentialism. The essentialist wants the connections between real material, external, empirical things to correspond to the logical connections in our concepts about them. And Hume is just going to attack the whole idea that they map onto each other at all. He's going to claim that the actual given realities of things, the empirical given realities of things, don't have such connections in them, and we put them all there gratuitously, right? And then Kant is going to ask.
Is it fair to say?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and then Kant is going to ask, right? How gratuitous is it that we put them there? And he's going to come away with the answer that we have to put them there. It's how we think, right? But it is true that our mind is what puts them there. It's not that we're reading them off from the reality. And that's going to give us the entire Copernican turn of seeing all this stuff as being part and parcel of what the mind projects onto the world instead of what's in the world to be read off of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this whole skeptical objection to logical essentialism, and then Kant's answer to that objection by turning that logical stuff into something the mind projected onto the world, whether it was already there or not, that whole set of things is going to, through and as a result of the challenge of skepticism, turn into this subjectivist turn in modern philosophy that sees everything in essentialism as a mind projection. And that's one of the reasons that, coming along after all that, Gilson, when he hears essence, just thinks thought. He thinks that the whole order of essences, the whole order of the logical connections behind things, is just talking about thought, because he's already after the Copernican revolution, where that's how a critical idealism a la Kant, right, dealt with the skeptical objections to all these logical connections you're seeing between things aren't there in the givenness of things. It looks like you just put them there, right? So then Kant is going to say, yes, we put them there, but we have to. That's how we think. And Nietzsche is going to say, actually, you put them there, and they're just the kind of error without which creatures like us cannot live. But we have no right to them. There's no reason to think that they're true. They're just more or less useful to us because they're our blind, wild guesses, right? So Gilson is thinking of that whole later history as he looks back upon this. When you talk about what's at stake, he's thinking that the whole order of essential connections between things is open to this skeptical objection. And then the reaction to that skeptical objection is going to be this giant subjectivist turn. And he doesn't like that subjectivist turn or where it comes out. And he's trying to see, is there a way that you can avoid this whole subjectivist turn by having a notion of the reality of things, or the metaphysical structure of things, that isn't open to this objection, that already incorporates something like the given thatness of things. And he thinks that that's already there in Aquinas, and that the scholastics left that road and didn't follow it and went down this, Platonic rationalist direction instead, straight into Hume's attack. Anyway, a bunch of that is the stuff we're
So
going to
is
get
it
to in the next
fair?
chapter, but go ahead.
Right. So with these essentialists that we're talking about here, so Duns Scotus, Suarez, Avicenna earlier, is it fair to say then that what's at stake for them, in a sense, they want to eliminate facticity, or they don't want to give facticity any right? They want to say, actually, there really is no such thing as facticity. Even the bare thatness of things
I don't think so.
Essence.
I don't think that's true, because each of them has their own version of explaining what that phenomena is. All of these are people after Aristotle. All of these are people that have heard Aristotle's critique of Platonism. They've all tried to adapt to it. In the case of Avicenna, his adaptation to it is he's put a God concept as the conferrer of thatness upon things at the top of his metaphysical hierarchy. The top of his metaphysical hierarchy is not an idea of the good, and it's not a Parmenidean one. It's being itself. And then he wants to read off the thatness of things as conferred upon the particulars by being itself, as the sort of ontological structure of all of the finite particulars. So his concession to thatness is there is the thatness of the world tout court, right, which is just that being is, right? That's all in a way echoing all the way back to Parmenides. But that's the only place where he has this room for thatness, right? From the standpoint of that notion of thatness, givenness or existence is an accident befalling the essences. It's exterior to the essences, but it's something which happens to them. Okay, that's the first version of it in Avicenna. The second version of it in Duns Scotus is he's going to say that all of our essential understandings are more or less specific or under specific maps to things. And the reason that they seem abstract is because we're usually using the cruder, broader versions of them. We're talking about all beings, we're talking about all animals, we're talking about all men, we're talking about all Athenian philosophers. We're doing all these subsetting operations, and we're not getting down to the individual, right? But he thinks that in doing that, we're always employing the same logical subsetting, definitional, conceptual machinery. And if we keep doing that all the way, do we have Athenian philosophers with snub noses who lived between, lived in the fifth century BC or whatever, and died in this era after this trial, and were teachers of Plato, and add on a bunch of other definitions like that, and then at the end of all that, and say, and of those things that fit that definition, this one right here, right? Add an individuating thisness at the end of that whole chain, and he says, now you've got actual Socrates. Actual Socrates is that whole set of things, which includes his entire span in time, his entire span in space, all his relations, and his thisness tacked on at the end. That whole set of logically subsetted into one another definitions, that's the actual Socrates. And you don't need anything else on top of that to make him the actual Socrates. And Duns Scotus thinks the reason that people like Aquinas thought you needed to add an existence on top of that was because you needed a principle to individuate them, to pick out which one, because they were always using broader classes for everything essential. They thought that the essences were broad classes. They thought that the essences were more than one. And that's why they thought that you needed something else to individuate. But if you add the full range of determinations down to, duration and time, location and space, and a thisness pointing at it, then Duns Scotus says that's all you need for the conceptual machinery to reach the actual particular. Okay, so Scotus has given you all that, and then after Scotus, Suarez hears all that. He sees the debate between Scotus and Aquinas, and he thinks, on the whole, Scotus is right, but he's complicated things a bit, right? He's complicated things too much. What you actually need to get to all the stuff that Aquinas wanted from existence that Scotus may or may not have tried to deal with his towers of, further determination and thisness, all you really need to say is actuality. You really just need the notion that it's actualized. So, and in a way that's harking back to Avicenna, of just putting the accident of being onto the essence, right? So from Suarez's point of view, he's trying to simplify Scotus, but incorporate everything he thinks that Aquinas means by givenness, but now he just wants that to be the actuality of things. So the thing which has this contingent given character is the being and act of actuality in time. And as long as you know that you're sometimes talking about the being an act of actuality in time, and you have other theorems like only actual things act in actuality, right? Then everything that Gilson wants from the requiring existential support of things for them to be real, right, is covered as far as Suarez is concerned. He thinks he's got a sufficient machinery to cover all of the what he thinks of as the concerns that motivated positing existence as something separate from essence. He says, yes, existence is something separate from essence. Existence is actuality plus essence, right? That's not just essence. It's a proper subset of essence where it's also actual. But he thinks that that's all you need to have existence. You have to compound the essential definition with its actualization. So all of these guys are trying to deal with the critique of the abstractness of Platonism, or the attempt to be comprehensiveness of Platonism, in their own way. They have their own way of ticketing and sorting the thisness of things, or the not simply captured by its definition of things, but they're doing that by saying it's the actuality, or it's the complete determination of essence, which Duns Scotus does not expect you to actually have, right? you don't have a complete definition of this horse, right? You've got some definitions it falls under that are necessarily crude maps. The actual definition of this horse includes a bunch of other things, which are particular to this horse and its whole history, that you don't know, right? If you knew them all, right, you could incorporate them into everything you know or predict about it. That kind of unknown slipperiness between your less than full concepts of the things and the things themselves may always be there, but it's just because you have an underdetermined concept of the thing. It's just because you don't know everything about it. You only know a few things about it from Scotus's point of view. Okay. I don't know if that helps with this. It's not that they don't see the problem of the givenness of things, it's they think they have conceptual solutions for it. And by solutions, I don't mean solutions that explain it away, but solutions that put it in its appropriate place and can explain the things which the Gilsonists and Thomists want a separate notion of existence for. Now, none of that is satisfying to Gilson, right? You can leave aside Scotus for a second, not Scotus, Thomas for a second, because we don't know if Aquinas would have agreed with this. But for Gilson, it's not satisfactory because for him, he's after a different ontological point, right? He wants to know what is the support for this essence such that it is real. And he has a prior belief that essences as such aren't real unless they have some other kind of existential support. He's starting from the presupposition that essences aren't real unless you prove to me that they are, if that helps. Okay, other questions or first reactions, Alex? Got to get to Craig's first reactions. I realize we've gone on, for an hour before we got to Craig getting his chance for first reaction.
Yeah, this was a tough one to read because it seemed like they were just arguing over language more than trying to dig into the concept, and that's just because I don't think we're in the same space they are. The one thing I had trouble with was the very concept of mind. Is it the mind of the one philosopher who thinks it? Is it the mind of God? Is it the mind of a lunatic? Is it the mind of anyone? So I was struggling with what he was really trying to do as a way of putting it off into mind.
Which one putting off into mind? Sorry.
I think it was. Now you got me confused.
Things in the mind are in themselves.
Yeah, Avicenna. When Avicenna said
okay,
things in the mind, is it Avicenna's mind? Is it God's mind? Is it the lunatic's mind? Doesn't matter.
I think in that part he was thinking just the human mind of a human being contemplating an external thing, right? And the question is, this is like we're thinking back to why Socrates came up with the notion of idea in the first place. And the situation is you've got someone trying to understand some true fact about external things. And he's doing so with, he's using ideas, essences, and abstractions to do so, right? So the question is, where are these definitional essences? To some degree, they're in the mind of Socrates thinking about the object he's thinking about. That's the mind that he's thinking of. To another extent, it's a pattern in the thing that the thinker is trying to think about, right? It's some actual relation or pattern in the external thing that the mind of the philosopher thinking about it is picking up upon. So in some sense, it's in the mind, and in some sense, it's in the thing. And Avicenna says, okay, essences are either in the minds or they're in the things, so we can also consider them in themselves, which is supposed to be how they can be at both places at once to allow communication between these two things. So the original Platonic reason for coming up with the notion of ideas in the first place was to have there be something in common between the minds and the things it's trying to understand, such that they can communicate with one another, such that there can be true understanding of external things, right? somehow something about the external things has to be able to be read off from them and get into the mind, right, for there to be true understanding of something. And that means that there has to be something that minds are like or do, and something that patterns and things are like or do, that they can both correspond to this third thing. Okay, so that's the notion of essence in the first place. The idea of essence is that there is something definitional like that can be both something like a thought or something like a thought exist in a mind as a thought or as a definition or as a piece of logic, and that can also be a pattern in things. It can be something real in external particulars. So that's where we get the notion of essence from Plato. And the question is, all right, where are those things? What are those things? You know, and the claim is that they are because they have to somehow be common to patterns and things and to minds thinking about them. They have to have some separate existence in themselves. That to Plato is the realm of the ideas. To Avicenna, who's influenced enough by Aristotle, it's really more just like a common or abstract, the essence itself, that is only actualized as either thoughts or patterns and things, but that as merely possibles could be in either or both, right? So Gilson gives the example of, you know, you have the idea of the stone, but all the stones have gone away, right? The idea of the stone can still exist in a mind as long as there's any mind there to support it, right? Or there's an actual stone, you look at it, you have the right idea about it, you have the whole notion of the stone, and then all the minds go away. The stone is still there, right? So without there being any communication necessary between them, the stoneness seems to be able to exist independent of all minds and independent of all stones. So because you could, you know, mentally in thought experiment, take away either side of them, and the thing would still meaningfully be the same essential, it somehow is independent of either side of that dichotomy. Its ontological support isn't just minds and it isn't just patterns and things, because either one of those suffices for it to make sense, right? Even in the absence of the other. Does that help?
Yeah, that's the challenge then. So if it's not on one side or the other, then where is it?
Yes, and the appropriate answer to this is, you know, just like Gilson asked that question, right? He says, where is it? And the appropriate answer to this question is just like in the previous chapter, he was taking Sigurd Brabant to task for asking, what is this existence things? And the answer is, it's not a what, right? Asking the awareness question of an essence, it's not aware, right? The underlying thought there is that of everything that is real, there is a where it is real, right? And the appropriate response is just, this is not observed. 2 + 2 being equal to 4 is not something that only exists in minds. It doesn't exist in the Andromeda Nebula, or, you know, there are truths that don't require a where in order to be true. So you can either expand your notion of where to include an abstract place for mathematical truth, which is what Plato does, or you can drop the idea that of everything that is real, it has a where attached.
Does it have an is attached?
This is the question. This is the question. So from the standpoint of all the essentialists in this chapter, right? There's a notion of existence, which is true of the possibles or of the abstracts, that is still an is, of which the actuals in time are a proper subset, right? So they want to say that their 2 + 2 is equal to 4. That notion of is a different notion of is from, you know, there is a car in the driveway across the street, right? But it's still a notion of is. And it's and that notion of is telling us something like enduringly present, you know, not necessarily actual in time, but, you know, in or out of time, enduringly present. And then all the essentials in this chapter want to deal with the fact that that's not the same thing as concrete being by having a term of distinction for the concrete being. In the case of Avicenna, that is existence added to essence as an accident that befalls essence. He uses the term existence. He's not an anti-existence person. He's a person who says existent is an accident that befalls some essences when they actually are. Right? That's Avicenna's version of existence and his way of explaining the difference between the things which are also actual in time and the things which are not actual in time.
So in our means of thinking, we tend to put time and space together. So R in time also implies R in space. Is that does that even come into the picture here?
Mostly. I'm using in time to denote the entire realm in which with which physics deals, as opposed to the realm with which mathematics deals, right?
So space time then.
Yeah, yeah. They use the terms in time, in creation, created, right, for all of those things, and they'll use the notions of eternity, outside time, or real for the contrary of all those things, right? So for Suarez, right, real denotes the whole realm of mathematical truth, and actual denotes the whole realm of physical reality, right? Now, within that whole realm of physical reality, certain things are actual only at certain times and in certain places, right? The rest of the time, they're possible, right, but not actual. The rest of the time, the rest of the place. So go ahead.
Quantum mechanics issue of when it becomes actual versus when it's a probability becomes a real.
Yes,
real
in a way
thing
that's kind of easier for Suarez, because he's expecting that that the actual is a proper subset of the possible, right? And he's got a notion of the possibles as anything possible as already being real, whether it's actual or not, right? And he doesn't care whether or not that realm of the possible is strictly restricted to the outside of time, right? He's just saying that the things which are actual in the Thomistic sense are proper subsets of the possibles. But if you want to have possibles inside time too, go nuts, right? So it would be fair to say that the notion of an actual possible, a compound of the two, may be something which is a little bit harder for him to deal with. But okay, we should probably go through the specific differences of all these people, but let's start with, I'm going to give Joe or Alex a chance to any reaction to what we said so far, or particular things you want to focus on or have questions about before we just try to go through each of them.
Well, just to jump in at your invitation.
Yep.
So one thing that sort of interests me, and I'm still figuring out, each of these guys is using the word real to describe one of the different levels, different from what we do in common parlance today. And that's something that I'm still trying to digest. Okay, if they have reality that's such that it includes mathematics, that's fine. I'm not surprised, and I might agree with that. But then if you try to bring it down to where it's actual, and you want to call it either existence or the same as existence, you basically ruled out the existence or the reality of mathematics. What have you done with them? Have you described them off to something called abstract? And
you haven't ruled out its reality. You said precisely that it's real, but not actual, right? So the Aristotelian term actuality, right, means to be an act, means to perform the act of existing in time, means to no longer be merely a potential, to actually have come together, occurred in something like its final form, to be performing the act of its essence, right? All is what we mean by something being actual. It's no longer thought-like, it's no longer just a pattern, it's no longer just the architectural plan, it's the actual house standing in front of you, right? Okay, and the claim is the truths of mathematics do not become actual in that sense, right? There may be uses of them, that are, applied mathematical use of a theorem, whatever. But that's, some physical structure that's becoming actual, not the theorem of mathematics. The claim is that the truths in total are bigger than truths of actual fact, because there's things which are true which aren't truths of actual fact. The actual, on the other hand, is the place where causal relationships between things you can hit with a stick transpire, something like that, right? So in the case of Avicenna, he's less concerned with calling those things the actual, like Suarez does, and he just calls it existent, right? He will say that this possible essence exists or becomes an existence, an existent, if existence befalls it, if it is instantiated, right? So he's thinking of the essences as possible patterns of possible existence, right? They are blueprints for things, but whether or not you have that thing depends upon whether or not that thing has actually been formed, constructed, made actual in time, and that is existence befalling that concept. And this is kind of backwards from thinking about things in terms of what's changing in actuality or what's changing in existence, where you think one existent, impacts another existence and a third existence results. This is instead thinking of the patterns, right? The possible shapes or patterns or configurations that things could be in. And you're saying, of all those possible shapes and patterns, this one has actually transpired right now, right? So you're thinking of existence from the point of view of what patterns or shapes it has taken on. Of all the possible patterns and shapes it could have taken on, which are, mathematical abstractions, so to speak, it is actually now taken on this one. That's the one that exists, right? So you're first in this giant possibility space of possible essences, but some determinate line of them is actualized, is existent. And to Avicenna, that is being, existence, befalling that particular sequences of essences. That make sense?
Yes. But it still doesn't quite tell me where the line where we use the word real exists. I mean,
yeah. So
just
they were using real.
It's actual.
No. So see, this is the thing. The scholastics were using real in a way more precise, delimited, specific sense than we tend to today, right? We tend to use real as a term that is for anything that isn't fake or anything that isn't unreal, right? We're contrasting with fiction, something like that. And Gilson wants to use real in a way which is almost synonymous with actual, right? He wants to use real if something doesn't have actual support, if something doesn't have actual existence which are supporting it, he doesn't want to think of it as real. In particular, he doesn't want to think of thoughts as real until they have some actual existential support. So,
I understand. I was equivocating in my own mind between our colloquial use of the word real and his more specific use of it. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, but you're not the only one, is my point. I mean, Gilson himself is often refusing to think the term real with the degree of specificity that some of these scholastics are using it. And he's doing the same sometimes with actual. So, Suarez will tell him, okay, you want to talk about the concrete particular, then you're talking about an actual essence. And Gilson's like, I'm not talking about the essence, I'm talking about the existence, right? Suarez is like, did you hear me say the word actual? Did you just ignore that part of my formula? I said 2 words, not 1, right? So the point is, when he says actual essence, Suarez is thinking he's giving you a compound formula for the thing that Gilson is talking about as existent or existence, right? The existent things are those which are actualized essences, which are very special essences, unlike all the other essences, because they're actualized. Okay, why is Gilson not satisfied with that, right? Okay. So this is on page 102, right? Where this is where Gilson is wrestling with Suarez's notion. Okay, here's a possible essence, then God creates it. What has God created? Obviously, God has created that essence. And as we already know, for that essence to be actualized by God to exist are one and the same thing. What Suarez fails to see, unless perhaps it is adversary himself suffering from double vision, is that when God creates an essence, he does not give it its actuality of essence. This is the important part, which any possible essence enjoys in its own right. What God has given it is another actuality, which is that of existence. So there, Gilson is exactly saying that every possible essence already has an actuality of essence. That means he's saying that every possible essence is already actual, but it's only actual as an essence right now. It's not actual as an existence yet. But that just means he's just said that a possible essence is an actual essence. But actual is the opposite of possible. Possible is used as a term of distinction from the actual. To Suarez, there's no such thing as the actuality of a possible essence, because it's the roundness of a square, right? But Gilson goes on, but what is lacking is existence. Creation does not actualize the essentiality of the essence, but it actualizes that essence in another order than that of essence by granting it existence, right? Why does Gilson say this, right? Down below it says, in a mind, an essence is in act through the existence of that mind. In a thing, an essence is in act through the existence of that thing. In no case is it true to say that an essence is in act through its actualizations qua essence. So Gilson's point there is that to him, essences only have the act of, or the act or being through the existence of the mind thinking them, or in the thing through the existence of the thing in which they exist as a pattern. And he says right afterwards, this is what Suarez forcefully asserts, right? And this is why he finally decides that between an actualized essence and its existence, there's no real distinction, but a mere distinction of reason, right? So the point here is that Gilson thinks that essence itself is so thought-like that it requires an existential support to be, and it has no sense of being without such an existential report of like a mind that's thinking it. And because of that, he thinks that even possible essences already exist in act because he's thinking of the act of the existent mind that is thinking about them. He doesn't think of the essence as something off the Platonic realm of the ideas that might or might not be realized, because for him there is no Platonic realm of the ideas. When the idea is an idea, it's an idea as a thought in a mind. And it's already actual. It's just only actual in the order of essence and not yet actual in the order of existence. It already exists, but it exists as a thought, not as a reality. So this is why existing in act is something he sees everything as having, but existing in reality, he thinks plenty of things don't have because they're just thoughts. So just thought is the way to understand Gilson. He thinks that something being a thought is the same as saying that it is less than a full being. Okay, does that help? Okay, welcome, Gabriel. I realize you're coming in the middle. I want to ask, did you manage to do the reading, and do you have first reactions you want to share with us?
I did do the reading. I finished it about a week or so ago, so it's a lot of it isn't fresh in my mind. But I felt like I guess I felt a bit eager to see where he's trying to get to, I guess, with Aquinas and his idea of the adequate, philosophy.
Yes.
But so I thought it was sort of like a little bit prolonged, especially since I didn't know as much about these thinkers that he dwelt on this time. But I think it was also a bit of more of a struggle to kind of follow his logic this time. Although I think I got it eventually, but it just seemed a little harder. But yeah, those are my impressions.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so you were talking about before, I mean, one of the main problems in this chapter is that he's trying to explain to you three people he violently disagrees with, right? These are all the medieval essentialists, right? Avicenna, Scotus, and Suarez. They're all on the Platonic end of the spectrum compared to where he wants to come out. And so he's explaining their doctrines to you while he himself doesn't really think that way. So partly you're getting his versions of his criticisms of them. And as you say, he hasn't really told you where he wants to go instead. So it's not his sort of all of his own cards aren't on the table. He's just giving his criticisms without it being obvious why he thinks that that's wrong. But there's other places where it's like, it's not obvious that he's actually understanding them or understanding them fully or in their own terms. I do think that he manages to bring across the notions of being an essence that each of them has. I don't know how fairly, if I can put it that way. I think that I come out of reading this chapter thinking that he has been a little bit unkind or uncharitable to them, and that they sound a lot more reasonable than he's trying to make them sound, right? I have a particular soft space for Scotus in this compared to Avicenna or Suarez, but yeah, so that's definitely one of the challenges of the chapter. In terms of when we're going to get to sort of his own motivations, a lot of his motivations come out in the next chapter where he's talking about where all this went to in Kant. And in a way, he thinks that this sort of essentialist understanding of being coming out of the scholastics continued through Descartes to Christian Wolff, and was the kind of dogmatic philosophy that Kant was reacting against. And Kant was reacting against it in part because it was open to a bunch of skeptical criticisms from Hume. So basically, Kant's ways of trying to answer Hume's skeptical arguments against this kind of essentialism wind up with a kind of very subjective turn in modern philosophy that Gilson himself doesn't like very much. So he thinks of Aquinas as kind of the road not taken that wouldn't have led to the Kantian impasse, so to speak. So fundamentally, Hume is going to challenge whether or not any of our conceptual machinery in all of our logical essential thinking is actually true about the existent given realities, the empirical realities. And from a skeptical point of view, he's going to claim, none of that tissue of logical connections between things is actually in the things themselves. You're just making it up, right? And Kant is going to answer about that with something like, yes, we're making it up, but we have to make it up because that's how we think about things, right? And by the time of Hegel, that's going to turn into, we live in a world that is how we have to think about things, but it's a world of thought. So we're going to wind up with this kind of subjectivist turn of this whole understanding of the logical machinery of the world was put there by the mind, not read off from the world itself. And that kind of sort of that sort of subjectivist outcome of the skeptical critique of essentialism is why Gilson thinks there's danger in it, right? It's vulnerable to a skeptical objection that is only answered by a subjectivist turn, right? And at the end of that subjectivist turn, you'll get Nietzsche saying, not only did we put it all there, but we put it all there erroneously. It's just a tissue of error that are the particular kinds of errors that are useful for us, right? Etc. Right? So all of that Kant to Nietzsche outcome Gilson thinks are consequences of the vulnerability of essentialism to Hume's attack, if I can put it that way. So after he explains that whole modern stuff down to Hegel, basically, he's then going to give a chapter about Aquinas where he says, you know, the road not taken back in scholasticism before they went in this essentialist direction, right? Here's a different understanding of and reaction to, different understanding of existence that he thinks is less open to that, to the Humean attack and the Kantian answer, so to speak. Okay, so that's a little bit about where his motivations are going to be coming from eventually. It has to do with a whole bunch of the later history rather than these people themselves. And we'll have to see how just that is in terms of, you know, how forceful or successful are Hume's criticisms in the first place, and how necessary is the Kantian answer to them, and so on. But that's sort of his own, a bunch of his own motivation. Okay, and it's fair to say he hasn't laid all those cards on the table yet, right? Some of them don't only come out as motivations in chapter 4, and they are only, you know, in terms of how he thinks Aquinas isn't as susceptible to this, it only comes out in chapter 5, right? But here he's just giving you, this is the medieval essentialism that was still there at the time when, you know, Kant put pen to paper, as the, you know, the philosophy of Christian Wolff inherited from Descartes, and that goes all the way back to Avicenna. Okay, fine question. Reactions to any of that? No, not yet.
Not yet. I
So-
was interested, and you may have covered this already, but I was interested in like Scotus.
Oh yes.
I didn't know much about him, but what I had heard about him made me think he was kind of, well, not so much an essentialist. What I had heard about him was sort of that he emphasizes the individuality of things,
Yes.
which to me kind of pushes against that. But I got a different impression from reading Gilson.
Yes. So if fair point. So we did cover this a little bit before. We can definitely go back over it. So a little bit of background from the Avicenna part, right? So the Avicenna is going to say that existence is something that is really distinct from the essence and is added to the essence, but it's an accident of the essence, right? It befalls the essence that it happens to exist, right? And that's sort of the version of existence that you get in Avicenna, right? And we talked about how in the Arabic, these different distinctions of not distinctions, these terms answer different questions about something, right? The thatness that something is what gets translated as existence, but in the Arabic, it's really just thatness, right? It's the word that they use to translate Greek being is the Arabic for thatness. It's answering the question of that the thing is. And then essence is whatness, right? It's what the thing is. But they have another term, which is the he-ness of the thing, the third person impersonal pronoun, the he-ness or itness of the thing. And this answers the question of who the thing is in Arabic, right? And this is what gets translated as identity, right? So the who-ness, the answer to the third person pronoun of the thing, what he, she, or it is this thing, right? That is what gets translated as the thisness, right? It's what Duns Scotus turns into the hikitas or thisness of the thing. And what's the distinction there, even at the level of Avicenna? So that the thing is something which all the things which actually are share, right? But it's the existence added to this thing. The whatness is the definition that it can share with anything else in the same class. The thisness is the thing that makes it this particular or this individual, right? So I use the example of the Nissan Sentras, right? All the Nissan Sentras that actually exist share thatness, and none of the Nissan Sentras that are just conceptual things on drawing boards do, right? all of them share the same definition, design, whatness down to a few particular accidents, right? But the thisness is what makes this particular Nissan Sentra sitting in my driveway, not where somebody else's driveway, there isn't actually one in my driveway, right? This one, right? So it's the index number across all the instances, right? And in Arabic, that's just answering the question of who, right? In a third person it-like sense, the itness of the thing, or the he-ness of the thing. Okay, so that's just sort of background already there in Avicenna before you get to Scotus. What Scotus is noticing is that for people like Aquinas, he especially in their arguments against the Averroistics types, the Averroistic types had this notion that if something isn't a material particular, if it isn't material, if it doesn't have material individuation, then there's only one of it, right? Because it shares a definition, and if it doesn't have a material principle to differentiate it, then it's like all the others, right? So there was no notion of any difference between one and another unless the thing was material. And then Aquinas disagreed with that, and he wanted it to be possible for there to be, if you can put it this way, multiple instances of immaterial things, right? And existence performs the operation for Aquinas of an immaterial thing that matter performs for it for material things. It's the principle of individuation, right? So you have this existence or that existence, but the existence shared by the individual is the individuating thing, right? In the case of material things, it's this particular part of matter that was used to support its the instantiation of the essence. But for this immaterial thing, it's the existence added to it. Okay, that's the Aquinian solution. So Scotus says, okay, so the reason you needed an existence term was because you needed to be able to completely differentiate one essence from another when they otherwise shared a bunch of their definition. And Scotus is going to try to do that with purely essential machinery instead. So he says the reason that you have this impression that essences are general is that you're thinking of definitions which are insufficiently specific. You're just thinking of, rational animal, or you're thinking of Athenian philosopher, right? You're not thinking of this Athenian philosopher whose name was Socrates, who lived in this particular era and taught Plato and died in this day from hemlock. And, if I add all those extra determinations of him, and then at the end of all those extra determinations of them, I add a thisness to it, a this one pointing at it, right? If I add that whole sequence to it, then I can get you all the way down to the actual individual thing. So he wants that formula of all the essential determinations, including the pointer thisness at the end, right, pointing to this particular one, its index number of all the things like that. That is to Scotus the full essence of the thing, and that full essence of the thing with that last determination on it does everything that Aquinas needed the existence to do, he claims, right? So I don't need the existence as long as I have the thisness at the end of the chain of all the determinations instead. So he's trying to eliminate the need for an additional distinct term, a separate order of existence, by just having a more refined understanding of the essential determinations of things. By more refined, I mean he's recognizing that we normally use essences only in this broad class sense, but we can keep going all the way down to the final specific difference in the final thisness hicacity pointer that gets us all the way to the individual. And to Scotus, that all the way to the particular formula for the thing is the thing. And this is where Aquinas or Gilson would balk and say, no, that's just a formula for making the thing. It's just a recipe for the thing. The actual thing has to have something else added to it, which is that it actually exists in the order of actuality, as opposed to being a mere abstraction or a mere concept or a mere thought or a mere formula. And that's something like saying the territory isn't the map, right? Okay, so but that's this kind of specific difference of Scotus is he thinks that this fully variegated essential tower of finer and finer cross-cutting sets down to a final this pointer can get you all the way to the actual particular, all the way to the individual. Right. So that's the thing that Scotus specifically adds. Then Suarez, who comes after him in the chapter, is in a way trying to simplify from all that. And instead of needing that whole tower and a thisness at the end, he wants to say, what we really mean by the existent is just the actual essence. So by actual essence, he's not thinking of the essence as opposed to what isn't the essence. He's thinking the essence with something else added to it. That something else is that it exists in act, that it is actualized, that it occur in time, that it is instantiated. So he wants all the extra work that Aquinas is trying to get from the existence notion to come just from the actuality notion. He thinks that actuality is a proper subset of the real, and it's that proper subset of the real where the things have had existence happen to them, so to speak, in the Avicennian sense, because they are actualized, right? And he thinks that actualization can do for him everything that Aquinas needs existence for. Okay, and Gilson is not satisfied with that either, because he's worried about these essences that you're actualizing. He says these merely possible essences that you're actualizing are just abstract nothings in themselves. So if you actualize them, what do you get? Nothing. They were a nothing beforehand. If you actualize a nothing, you get a nothing. He also says that they already were actual in the domain of essences, by which he means something like they were already thoughts in minds, but all they were thoughts. And when they actually exist, it's the existing part that's added to that. It's not that they didn't have an actuality before, because they had an actuality merely in the order of essences as a thought, right? But the new thing about them is that they're actual in the order of existence, not in the order of essence, right? They had actual existence conferred upon them. All right, so they're talking past each other a little bit there, and that Gilson won't adopt the usage of the terms of Suarez of wanting the real and the actual to be different and actual to be a term of distinction. He's trying to say that the mere essences already are actual as thoughts. And from Suarez's point of view, that's confusing what he's trying to refer to with the fact that his mind is thinking about it, right? Not allowed, right? From Gilson's point of view, Suarez is missing the fact that in order to exist, any of these essences need some existential support. It either needs a mind thinking it or a real being in which it exists as a pattern. And from Gilson's point of view, all these essences only subsist in real existent things, right? They don't have any place to exist otherwise, so they don't actually exist otherwise. Okay. Anyway, that's the parts that you missed about us trying to tease out the where Gilson is in all this and how he's differing from the other three in the chapter. I think we also talked a little bit at the beginning about Avicenna's notion of God as being, and the way in which existence is necessary to God and accidental to everything else in Avicenna. And this is because for him, being itself, almost the concept of being itself, is what his notion of God is. So there is one being that is the being itself, being tout court, which is the necessary being, and it is necessarily because its existence follows from its concept, right? So in that sense, God is just an essence, but it's just the essence being. So it's the essence, in the case of God, his essence is equal to its existence. Its essence is to exist, right? Which is a formula we later get in existentialism for the Dasein, for the being there, for the individual person. But in Avicenna, right, the essence the essence that is being itself is what he means by God. And that means that everything else that exists only by participating in that essence, which is the same as saying that the idea of being is something that it participates in. And that's where he gets that everything is perishable except his face idea. He's trying to show that this is compatible with the Quran. So he quotes the line that there is no other God but him, everything is perishable except his face. The point being that the face there in the Arabic is the same word as idea in Greek. Idea is just face in Greek. So participation in being, participation in the idea of being, and having the face of being turned toward you are the same thing. So he's aligning the metaphysical thought that the face of God towards something makes it exist with the Greek notion that participation in the idea of being is to exist. They're both the same face as idea and participation idea, or notion rather. Okay. Anyway, that's just going over the parts you missed.
Thank you.
Questions about any of that? No. This issue of necessary being, by the way, and God as necessary being is something that you also find going straight from Avicenna to Duns Scotus. Duns Scotus famously revises all of Aquinas's arguments or proofs for the existence of God, and he comes up with his own instead, which is less dependent upon a Aristotelian first cause within time kind of argument. He wants it to be first cause in the metaphysical order of being, not first cause in time, because he doesn't want anything about those proofs to be open to any objections, skeptical objections about the reality of motion or the experience of time or when time originates or anything like that. But the result is a concept of necessary being winds up being the crucial conceptual machinery, so to speak, of Duns Scotus's proofs. And Duns Scotus is one who says that to someone who understands what the terms means, the proposition God is a tautology, right? That's the how necessary the necessary being or the being as God equation is for Scotus. And a bunch of this will matter later, because one of the reasons that Gilson is concerned about the Kantian turn, so to speak, is Kant is going to criticize all ontological arguments, right? He's going to say that all this essentialism winds up making ontological arguments where it tries to treat being as a real predicate. And he's going to say that that's a no-no from the point of view of the understanding. We cannot reason about being as a real predicate in that sense, or derive existence statements from essentials, right, from essences. So the point is that that argument in Kant is kind of aimed at the possibility of natural theology as such, but it's also especially squarely aimed at Duns Scotus, even more than against Anselm. Okay, and that's all going to be stuff that comes up in the next chapter, and it's useful to know all those things about how that's fundamentally the concept of God in and the proofs in Duns Scotus, and it's not disagreeing with, but of a piece with the definition of Avicenna, right? So the medieval semi-Neoplatonic Aristotelian confluent, whatever, Islamic philosophers and their notion of God as being and the notion of the high scholastics like Scotus are equivalent. They're not disagreeing on the subject. Okay. I do have a whole bunch of other stuff I can get into that's not necessarily directly in the chapter about the Avicenna stuff and where this degree of Platonism in Avicenna comes from. In a way, the previous chapter on the being and substance thing, we were all talking about the medieval Aristotelians in specifically. And now we're talking about kind of the medieval semi-Platonists, if I can call it that way. We called them the Essentialists earlier. But the point is that in a way they're all, they have more Platonism in them than Averroes does, for example. Okay, where does that extra Platonism in them come from? And the answer is that there's a whole bunch of continuity with the Neoplatonic tradition, all of these theological traditions. And we can go into that medieval history. There's other places here that Gilson kind of plays fast and loose with the history, if I may. And I want to go over. This is especially on page 83, where he talked about Etienne Tempierre, his namesake, and the condemnations of 1277, which I think we mentioned a little bit last time. So here again, you get Gilson purporting to claim for what a Christian theology requires of philosophy, where the requirements are less in order to be Christian and more in order to be the kind of Christian that Gilson likes. Right, he says the famous condemnation of Aristic and Avicennian theses of 1277 has no other meaning, which he mean that he would have to turn down the metaphysics of Avicenna as incompatible with his own view of the world. So the claim there is that the condemnation of 1277 was based upon the incompatibility of Avicennian notion of the world with a Christian theology, right? So he's basically saying if your metaphysics is Avicennian, your theology cannot be Christian, and that's what the condemnation of 1277 was about. That's the claim of that first paragraph on page 83. Here's the problem, right? That means that he's saying that the metaphysics of Duns Scotus and Suarez is incompatible with Christian theology, when they're easily two of the most important Christian theologians of the entire Middle Ages. So whatever requirement is being imposed here, it's Gilson's, not Christianity's. That's the first point to notice. It might be something which is that later doctrinal, Catholic theology of the 19th century was particularly concerned about. And it may be that he thinks that, there are particular things that Aquinas does for Christian theology that these other ones don't. But if for 400 or 600 years, right, the greatest Christian theologians, or half of the greatest Christian theologians, had a particular view of metaphysics and of God, right, to say that it's incompatible with Christianity is at least tendentious, right? It's not obvious. He's trying to say that okay, you get the point. And then there's the next question of, is this what the condemnation of 1277 was about? Well, the funny thing is the condemnation of 1277 included Aquinas, or at least a half a dozen of the propositions condemned in 1277, which were propositions being taught by Aquinas specifically, where he was viewed as too close to the Averroists, particularly in his doctrine of mind. So it's not like Bishop Tempierre was an Aquinas supporter stumping for Aquinas against Averroism and Avicenna. He wasn't an Aquinas supporter at all. He was kind of a supporter of older views of Augustine that were reflected in contemporary age by Bonaventura, and also a kind of precursor or forerunner of the same kind of arguments you find in William of Ockham that disliked all of this philosophical rationalism and theology as derogating from the omnipotence of God, right? It was fundamentally a against all this innovation, condemnation, and the innovations it was condemning definitely included Aquinas. And that's something which Gilson, doesn't sort of let on here, right? He pretends that it was only aimed at his opponents in this discussion and not at his favorite as well when it was. Okay. It's also worth noting that he Gilson regards the essential question here as what freedom God has with respect to the world. He even brings in Bergson in the question, right? And so he's showing some of these concerns are very 19th century, if I can put it that way, or 20th century. They're not the things which were the burning issues for Bishop Tempier, right? Tempier was not trying to save the freedom and indeterminism of the world. He was trying to save the omnipotence of God. Not the same thing. Okay. Anyone else have thoughts on that whole digression on freedom and what he called Greek necessity, the block of Greek necessity? Joe?
Yeah, I was the necessity of God, the necessity of existence. You were saying something there a minute ago that made me curious about. It's past. I'll come back.
Okay, so I mean, the thing is, he Gilson is saying, we previously saw that there was a whole bunch of this determinism in Averroes, right? That in Averroes you had this kind of sets of logical relations between things, that there was a way in which there was a Spinoza-like necessity to the unfolding of the world, right? And Gilson is sort of tracking what has become of that in Avicenna, right? And he says, true enough, in the world of, this is bottom of 82, true enough, in the world of Avicenna, there's an absolute certainty that each and every possible shall eventually materialize. What is eventual there is by no means contingent. Yet in such a world, essences always remain in themselves pure possibles. And no wonder, since the very essence of essence is possibility, right? So what's going on here is that for Avicenna, being itself or existence is an accident befalling the essences. The essences in themselves are merely possible, right? But all the merely possibles that ever actually are, right, are at some time in some place, right? The possibles, the only occurring at some times in some places coincide. Everything which is completely necessary is eternal, right? Everything which is necessary from its essence, I mean. If something is not necessary from its essence, then it's contingent, and it's only necessary from its cause, which means that such necessity as befalls it from outside as its existence or actualization, right, in the chain of causes, something like that. So that means that of everything which is actual, there's kind of a necessity to it being actual. It's because it was merely a possible. It being merely possible is the same as saying there's only a limited time and place, etc., other determinations like that, in which the accident of existence befell it. Right. This is sort of Avicenna's way of ticketing and sorting how the finite things, the finite and merely possible and contingent things are. They aren't in the way that 2 + 2 = 4, which is necessary and therefore eternally true. They are in the way a contingent material fact is true, which means that it's true because there is a notion of necessity to it, but it's a necessity that only comes to it from its causes. It doesn't have that necessity in itself. In itself, it's completely contingent, completely merely possible. And it only gets actuality, existence, and necessity from outside, from its causes. That's the Avicennian understanding of how possible and necessary line up with existent versus merely possible. Go, Joe.
Okay, so my missing idea a moment ago was this idea of the freedom of God that you talked about. So he can't be constrained by by anything beyond himself. That's a puzzlement to me, because that's what I understand William Vaughan claimed, and I think that's also what Al-Ghazali claimed.
Correct.
And I'm trying to puzzle out. So I associate both of those claims with saying that there's God, that's what God thinks, and that's the end of the discussion.
To some degree, but I mean, what's really going on there is there's a notion of something like a willfulness in God, right? In Avicenna, instead, there's a kind of logical necessity in God, right? The particular things have essential relations with one another, and they, once they are, they have to be the way that they are. They don't get to be any other way. What it means for them to have this essential definition instead of that essential definition is they have to act this way. Fire has to burn, right? Horses have to do horsiness. They don't get to do grasshopperness instead, right? That's what it means for them to have a particular essence. So the fact that they act in the fact that once they are, they must act according to the essence that they have, right? That's a realm of necessity, a chain of necessity, which is as purely constrained for Avicenna as the truths of mathematics are. God can't make squares round because round squares are self-contradictory. Fire that doesn't burn isn't fire to Avicenna, right? So he wants the same notion of essences having essential powers, because the essence, remember, is the set of all the essential powers of the thing. It's the set of all the relations it can enter into. That's what the essence means. So things have to follow their essences because it's the same logical order of necessity as truths of mathematics, that things act by their essences and not in some other way, right? So the notions of essences and the notions of the order of essences concatenating with one another logically includes this idea that their relations are necessary relations, okay, in the sense that they follow from their necessary powers. What Avicenna adds is that any of these things is purely contingent and up to God. But once it is, the thing that is the particular essence that God actualized, and that particular essence has necessary relations. It cannot act otherwise than than the what that it is. So you have a necessity of how the things act based upon their what. That they are was contingent. God didn't have to create them. He could have created something else that acted in a different way, but he didn't. He created fire that burns. He didn't create fire that freezes, right? So that's the sense in which there is both a freedom to God in terms of what is created and a necessity in the things themselves, in that they must act as they were created to act according to their essences. So from the standpoint of Ghazali, that's way too much necessity in the world and way too little freedom in God, right? From the standpoint of Avicenna, Ghazali is way too irrationalist, way too magical, right? From the standpoint of Avicenna, God acts if he acts by making things which have essences which act the way that they were intended to act, but they have to act that way. They don't get to act differently on some other whim, whether of a finite embodied mind or of a God who contradicts himself by willing one thing when he made the essence of the thing and willing something else when he wants the fire to freeze things instead of burning them, right? By the way, this is also a subject which is discussed with Averroes instead on this book, worth looking up sometime if you care. The metaphysics of causation. The idea here is that unless there is actual causal necessity in things, it doesn't make sense to say that things have essences at all. That things are as particular essences, that they have essences, and that they have necessary effects are the same idea, according to Averroes on this. And I think Avicenna is not disagreeing with him on that. So having essences and necessary action go together, because what we mean by the essence is that there's something like a logical core of the relations of the thing, which is like the irreducible, not accidental part of it, that has to be that way. If something doesn't have to be that way, it's not part of the essence, it's an accident, right? But when you're talking about the parts which are essential, you're talking about the parts that have to be that way and cannot be otherwise. Well, if it's part of the cannot be otherwise of the thing, to think of the cannot be otherwise of the thing being contingent is a round square. You're saying both that it's not an accident, that it's essential, and that it could be otherwise. That doesn't work. So in the Islamic theological context, the occasionalists recognized that logic in the arguments of the philosophers, and they said, okay, what we really mean by our occasionalism is to say there are no essences, there are only accidents, right? So the occasionalists went there and they just said, okay, you're right about essences, there aren't any, right? Essences are necessary, but for God to be omnipotent is the same as saying there are no essences, there are only accidents. And if God wants fire to freeze tomorrow and burn the next day, you can't stop him, right? That's the kind of attitude that the Asherite theologians, even before Ghazali, had towards the philosophers. Okay, and that's close to what, where William of Ockham would come out. Now, the other thing to notice here is that this is why Hume and William of Ockham, that is, and Ghazali and the Asherites are of a piece. Why? Because Hume is going to tell you that you cannot know of an essence that the thing must act that way. And that's almost the same as saying that there aren't any. What Hume is going to say is not that essences don't exist. He's going to say your reason for supposing that these exterior objects have essential powers that they cannot ever deviate from is just a limited inference from a few past observations that you have of them, and it could change tomorrow, right? You don't have any good epistemological reason for your ascription of essences to things, which is the same as saying, if there are essences in things, you put them there. They're imaginary, right? Which is the same as saying there aren't any real essences in things. So Humean skepticism and Asherite occasionalism wind up in the same place. Both of them deny causality as a knowable thing, right? Okay. In the case of the theologians, they're doing that in part because they want to ramp up this notion of will. And there were other arguments leveled against them that will itself implies or requires the idea of causation. Otherwise, it makes no sense. This is like a rejoinder that the philosophers had to that line of argument from the theologians, which is it doesn't make sense to will something unless there's an order of necessity in which your will can be effective. Something like that. You cannot will things except effects. And you cannot will effects if you don't have instruments that don't turn into taffy when you try to use them, right? To be able to will something is to be able to change the world by pushing around objects or levers or something that actually impacts the world in some way. If all of those levers are made out of smoke, right, then you cannot will anything. You might wish for something, but to will to enact something, you have to have means of affecting something, and you can't have means of affecting something without necessary causation between your will and the thing you're affecting of some kind or another. So the rejoinder of the philosophers was that there is no will without causation. Anyway, but the point is that the skeptics and the God is omnipotent people wind up in the same place because they're both denying the same thing, which is a knowable necessity in things. Okay. and it's curious on page 83 where Gilson is showing his own objections to what he sees as being too much necessity in Avicenna's metaphysics. He's not entirely clear what Gilson, thinks a proper metaphysics, or a metaphysics he thinks is compatible with his Christian worldview, would require, right? So Gilson says, everything is free in a Christian universe, since even what is binding law to matter is freedom to God, but there's nothing in this world of sense to compare with man in this respect. From the point of view of his body, man's freedom is but God's freedom, while his mind, he has access to the limits of his essence, within the limits of his essence, to a freedom that is truly his. Each and every man then, in order to both to be and to freely act, must needs be a being which is, etc. Okay, so he needs there to be a freedom in contingency, both with respect to God and with respect to men as finite beings. But he thinks that there being stable essences that have acts of necessity derogates from that, or impedes that sense. And then he's projecting that motivation back onto Etienne Tempierre in the condemnation of 1277. It's not there, I can tell you that, right? But he wants a radical newness of truly free acts for acting man, and he's calling that, a requirement of a Christian theology, and what Christian theology can tolerate. And my point earlier was that there's a problem with that, because for centuries, the Scotians and the Suarezians contradict him on the point and don't see any incompatibility of that with Christian doctrine. He calls this the block of Greco-Arabic necessity, which he says disintegrates under the pressure of two charges of theological explosive. So he's got an imaginary enemy of indeterminacy here, which consists of the Greek notions of necessity and Arabic notions of necessity, where he's thinking first and foremost of the Averroistic version of that, but extending it even to the Avicennian notion of stable essences. He's thinking all that is too much necessity for him, even though the Avicennian version of it includes a contingency of the thatness that this or that particular essence is being freely up to God. That's not enough. It's not enough contingency for Gilson. Okay. Okay, was all that clear? Not clear? Go, Alex.
Yeah, I want to, just in relation to all of this, there is this point that I found very interesting, and I think it connects with this, with these issues. And it's, so the point about what is required for something to come into existence. Is it a finite
Yes.
act, or does it require God's infinite act?
Yes.
And I'm looking for a quote.
Okay, so I know the part you're talking about. This is the famous fight between Aquinas and Scotus on whether or not to create something out of nothing requires infinite power. And Aquinas says to create might not require infinite power, but to create something out of nothing requires infinite power. And Scotus says, no, it doesn't. The finite thing created requires only as much power to create as that finite thing has, and it's finite. So from Scotus's point of view, every finite power that is created requires only finite power to create. And in no way does the requirement go to infinity just because it's from nothing. The quote is yes, page 91, right? In Scotus's own cryptic and excellent formula, non plus deficit nihil ab ente quam ens liquid ponet, right? He says it cannot be translated, can be decoded as the distance from nothing to being is no greater than being itself makes it, right? The right way of putting it would be more like not more the distance between nothing and the thing than the thing, right? The thing is only above the zero of non-existence by as much as it is in existence, not by infinity. You might say that he has the additive, not the multiplicative version of the of how much above nothing the thing is, right? Something is size 10. How much above nothing is it? The answer is not 10 divided by 0. The answer is 10, right? 10 minus 0, not 10 divided by 0. And Aquinas is thinking 10 divided by 0. So it's infinite to go from 0 to 10. And Duns Scotus is saying, nope, it's just additive. It's just 10 minus 0. It's just 10, right?
I guess the way it's making sense to me is it seems that for Scotus, definitely there's something quantitative about existence, right? And there's even,
Absolutely.
he mentions a few times on the same page even that some of his followers even called it the degree
Yes.
of essence, right?
Yes.
Which is a quantitative notion.
Yes, absolutely.
And it seems to me for Aquinas, maybe being or existence, there's actually something qualitative about it. And there is this infinite leap that's required between the nothing and the something that it's like there's no common measure between them. It's it's a kind of, I don't know how to express the infinity, but it seems to me like there's something about, like, this is a different quality.
Right, but it's
It's
not.
like a different category.
He actually is calling it an infinite difference, not just calling it a difference of quality, right? Which means he himself is also thinking about it quantitatively. He's thinking about it as a divided by 0, right? He's thinking of it as an infinite distance because it's you only had a basis of 0, and to get from 0 to anything is an infinite distance. That's what he's thinking. To get from anything small to anything else, small or bigger, is a finite distance, but to get from 0 to anything is an infinite distance. That's what he's thinking. And that means he is thinking it quantitatively, but he's thinking it in terms of proportion, not in terms of addition, so to speak.
Right.
But you're right that Scotus is a very mathematical or quantitative thinker in this regard, and that's because for Scotus, you can think of all of these essential relations as being like set relations. They're all contained within relations, right? They're all bigger and smaller and contained within and cross-cutting formalities. He's already thinking in set theory terms, so to speak, without calling them sets, but in the same sense of, cross-cutting distinction in positioned logical space, right? That's the way Scotus thinks. And when he gives his existence proofs, they're all about the possibility of chains of more or less in the right. They're chains of more or less in the category of being or in the category of inclusiveness, right? It's and he says there can be multiple ways in which you can think of something as being prior to another or something as being first with respect to another, right? But if you think of all of them together, all of them have a notion of first, right? And if you ascend all of them all the way, all those notions of first will have to converge, right? Because otherwise you'll have a prior of one to the other, and one of them will fit into the other one, right? So you get, of all these different possible abstract notions of first, there's the firstest first, right? There's there's first in all the orders, right? And this is the kind of reasoning you would get like in trying to think about the axiom of choice and a well-ordered set. It's that abstract, right? It's the kind of stuff you find in analysis, so to speak. So he's very much this sort of quantitative logical space kind of thinker, Scotus.
Right. Yeah, I guess for
I wanna-
Aquinas,
Before you get to Aquinas, I just want to mention one other thing. There's a predecessor, a precursor of Scotus in this regard, which is John Philoponus. When John Philoponus is trying to argue against Aristotle's arguments for the eternity of the world, he also has to deal with the Aristotelian objections to creation from nothing. And he makes very similar arguments to the ones Scotus makes here about the finitude of the distance between an existence which is finite in time, which is what Philoponus is imagining, and non-existence, right? If you were making something that had infinite power, it might require an infinite power. But if you're making something which is finite in existence and finite in power, it requires only a finite power. This is a claim in Philoponus. So that's kind of a precursor of Duns Scotus here, and it's directed against Aristotelian attempts to prove that the world cannot be created in time. Aristotelian proofs against creation are they argue that the universe, if the universe exists eternally, it requires an infinite power for it to exist, right? And then an infinite power created out of nothing is impossible. Something like this. This is the argument that you get from Aristotle in the Metaphysics, where he thinks that what that proves is not that God is omnipotent, but he thinks that it proves that that such creation is impossible, and therefore the world must be eternal. It must always have existed and always continue to exist. So when he gets a first mover, which you also get in Aristotle, it's first in the order of causation. It's not a first simply in time. But sorry, Alex, I was interrupting you.
Yeah.
You're trying to go in the direction of where Aquinas is on this. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. I guess I want to push back a little bit on the quantitative interpretation, just because in Aristotelian thought, quantity is one of the categories.
Sure.
Right. So it's a kind of accident of the substance, and I would have the sense that
it can be essential, but it's an attribute of the substance.
Right.
It might be an essential attribute or it might be an accidental one, but it's particle of the substance. Yes, keep going.
Okay, yeah. And well, I guess that makes me wonder if when it comes to, the change or the leap, this infinite change from nothing to something, whether it's thought, I mean, quality is also a category, right? So I wonder if in Aristotelian terms, and I guess by extension for Aquinas, we may be talking about an infinity that is other than mathematical. And I'm not sure what that might be, but yeah, so that's the sense that I have there, if that makes sense at all.
Not quite, because it's not clear how much of that is Aristotelian, right? Right. So. Right. So Gilson tries to say, if actual existence of a posits a being out of nothing, then the power that creates it can expect no cooperation whatever from its effect, and such a power must needs be infinite. Not so with Duns Scotus. To him, as to Thomas Aquinas, the ontological distance between God and his creatures is infinite. But the Scottish reason for that is that God's essence is infinite, whereas the essence of things are finite. There is then an infinite distance between any finite being and the being of God, but this by no means implies the distance between a finite being and nothingness is also infinite. Quite the reverse. Since the being in question is finite, its remoteness from nothingness cannot be greater than what it itself is. Right? So in Thomas's doctrine, the fact that God proves finite beings does not prove his all-powerfulness. Only the fact that if to create were nothing more than Thomas would fully agree with Scotus. But Thomas adds, although to create a finite effect does not point to an infinite power, to create it out of nothing does point to an infinite power. And Scotus doesn't agree, right? So the question is, what degree of power does it take to create something? If you don't add out of nothing, then they both agree that it's finite if the thing is finite. But if it is out of nothing, then Aquinas says the degree of power involved is infinite, and Scotus says no, it's as finite as the thing created. And Scotus is not saying that because he thinks that God is finite in power, but because he thinks that nothing in the order of finite being tells you anything about the infinity of God. Scotus thinks the thing you know about the infinity of God, you know from reason. He doesn't think you know it from the empirical realm at all. But that's just because he thinks that infinity is fundamentally a concept, if I can put it that way. But yes, and this is another one where another place in which, whether he knows it or not, I don't know if he even read Philoponus, but Scotus is coming out in the same place as John Philoponus. Philoponus has to argue against, he has to argue the possibility of creation out of nothing against Proclus and the pagan Neoplatonists and Aristotelians both. In order to try to make plausible what Philoponus sees as the Platonic notion of creation. From Philoponus' point of view, the big debate between Plato and Aristotle is whether or not the world has a beginning in time. And Plato is the guy who says that it does. And Aristotle thinks that he can prove that the world cannot possibly have an existence in time. Sorry, a beginning in time. But when Philoponus wants to argue that it is possible, he argues that many of the things that we talk about as essences are arrangement-like, are shape-like, and that's what their actual being consists in, right? And that kind of shape-like conferred being, so to speak, the being of an arrangement, we always expect to be created out of nothing. We never expect it to require any precursor in the order of the arrangements. It is true that for the material arrangements, we think of them as also requiring a prior matter, right? So the Aristotelians think that you cannot have, you cannot create any subsistent thing without the prior existent thing, right? And they point to matter or prime matter as the thing that is required before any other arrangement like creation. And Philoponus's argument against that is, you don't know that the matter that you think is at the bottom of things isn't itself just an arrangement in logical space. And that's the end of his argument against the Aristotelian impossibility of creation from nothing. And it's an amazingly sophisticated argument for when it's coming out, right? It's the kind of thing you could easily find, a modern physicist having, and there wasn't an answer to that. There wasn't a rejoinder to that from the Aristotelians. They either didn't understand it, or they thought that it was just obviously violated their intuition about the necessity of matter for anything arranged to exist. They couldn't think of matter as less than the bottom atomic concept, so to speak. They couldn't think of matter as itself a derived thing. Anyway, just these are some of the precursors of the Scotian position in all this. I think that the Scotian position is way more robust than Gilson thinks it is. It's not that we know that it's right or anything like that. It's just it's consistent. It's remarkably consistent. I mean, if you read Scotus, he's an extremely powerful logical thinker. He's not as clear as Aquinas in many respects. Aquinas is a blindingly clear thinker. You read 10 pages of Aquinas and you think, wow, that made a whole bunch of things I was thinking about in a confused way much more clear, right? He gives you 6 different distinctions and the whole thing just falls into place, right? And Scotus is not clear in that manner. What he is logically forceful in the way that some mathematical reasoning is, right? There's some mathematicians or logicians that you read them and you see the force with which the conclusion follows from the premises, so to speak. And that's more what he is, what Scotus is like. He was also remarkably young. I mean, almost all of his work was, he died when he was like 45 or something. Almost all of his work was done in his younger years, like many a mathematician. Anyway, fine questions. I've got a bunch of stuff that I don't know if we want to get to about the tradition that gave us Avicenna, because Avicenna might look like he just came flying in out of nowhere here with his differences from Averroes and his semi-continuation of the Platonic tradition. There's a whole wonderful, intricate prehistory of where Avicenna gets some of these notions from. It goes back to the kind of putting all the Aristotle and Neoplatonism together and putting all of those things together with the theology of the monotheisms that happens between the late classical world and the early Islamic translation efforts world of the circle around Al-Kindi that's translating all of the Greek works into Arabic. And a bunch of these notions get they kind of gel then, and they get passed on to Avicenna. And Avicenna and Averroes to a lesser degree, through his commentaries on Aristotle especially, are the place that all those things come into the West, right? But in the East, in the Islamic world, the predecessors to Avicenna, the kind of things he's thinking of and reacting to, besides some things in Farabi, especially in logic, are the theology of Aristotle and the Book of Causes. The Book of Causes was a thing which circulated under that name and was heavily influential in the Christian West too. I mean, Aquinas writes a long commentary on the Book of Causes, right? It's like considered one of the main philosophical texts. There were typical philosophy courses in the medieval university where you would spend a semester just reading the Book of Causes, right? And the Book of Causes is kind of a Cliff Notes to Proclus Neoplatonism, if I can put it that way, that gives a whole doctrine of the hierarchy of being. There's a kind of Proclean Neoplatonism, and that was well accepted in Christian theological circles of the late ancient world. Think of the time of early Byzantium, whatever, something like that, the time of Justinian or something. And it also gets passed in that form as the Book of Causes through Syria to the circle around Al-Kindi, translating all the Greeks in Baghdad in the 8th century. So that's the Book of Causes side of it, and you get a kind of Proclean Neoplatonism. The other one that was influential was what was labeled the theology of Aristotle, and it's mostly the second half of Plotinus Enneads, like 4 to 6. So there's six main books of Plotinus, and the last 4 are covering especially the doctrine of the soul and the mind and all that. And those were the ones that were translated together as and then labeled as the theology of Aristotle. And why? Because, I mean, it's this Neoplatonism. Why it's being called Aristotle? The answer is because Aristotle is already thought of as the guy who has proved the existence of God from the first cause argument. And, he's the philosopher who says that God is thought thinking itself and all this other stuff from the metaphysics. And they get this transcript of Plotinus, and they see ways in which it's already been put together with Aristotelianism by some of the late commentators on Aristotle, people like Themistius and so forth. All of this was put together probably in the Syrian Near East, Christian Syrian Near East, before it gets to Al-Kindi's circle. But the actual composition of the theology of Aristotle was probably some Nestorian monk in the circle of Al-Kindi who was involved in the translation stuff, and he was transcribing stuff from Plotinus, but with his own additions, right? He was putting his own additions that he thought were going to make it consistent with what he knew about Aristotle, make it consistent with what he thought of was the Aristotelian Neoplatonic consensus or synthesis, whatever. So you get this thing which is largely Plotian Neoplatonism, but with elements of Aristotelian thought thrown in. And that circulated for centuries in the Islamic Near East as the theology of Aristotle. And because that was the name on the page, right, people did not think that Aristotle thought something different from this on theological questions. They didn't think of Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism as being in violent contradiction with one another, because there had already been this effort to put them together, and that effort seemed to work. And so this Neoplatonic synthesis that you get in the theology of Aristotle and in the Book of Causes was like sort of the immediate predecessors to Avicenna. Those are the things he's reading. They're coming out of Al-Kindi's circle. They're purporting to be translations of great Greek works, right? The great Greek philosophers, taught us this about the divine science, right? And so now comment on them and develop them. That's the sort of stuff that people between Al-Kindi and Avicenna were doing. And they're also, relating all that to the theological controversies of their day, so to speak. And Avicenna is kind of a great systematizer who's going to put all that together into a coherent doctrine, right? And I think it's fair to say he did a thorough job of it, right? In the sense that what you get in him is a consistent doctrine that manages to put together the requirements of a being first monotheism, so to speak, or being first theology, as opposed to the one first or good first versions that you have in actual Plotinus. Putting that together with some Aristotelian notions of actuality and potentiality and understanding of the nature of the soul and so forth, and putting all that together with this still Platonic essentialism, right, of the sort of logical or definitional machinery of things. And all along with Aristotelian logic, and sort of that's sort of what you get in Avicenna. But he's a systematizer, cleaning up and smoothing out the rough edges of the things that have been put together. A bunch of the being put together had already happened before him in these intermediate sources of the theology of Aristotle and the Book of Causes. And then in the West, when Aquinas is, or for that matter, even Alfred the Great, is studying these things, he has the Book of Causes in front of him. He has Avicenna in front of him, right? In Latin translation, and they have commentaries on Aristotle by Averroes as the more Aristotelian position, so to speak. But the Neoplatonic position, they're not getting it just from Augustine. They're not getting it from Bonaventura in the same day. They're getting it from the Book of Causes. They're getting it from Avicenna, who they're also reading. Okay, so any questions about all of that intricate history? One of the things that's so striking to me is how, in a way, ecumenical all of this is, right? They're trying to understand the metaphysics and trying to understand it logically and consistently. And the result is, even though they're having, definite philosophical disagreements with one another, none of them feel like partisan ones. None of them feel like party position ones, at least until you get someone like William of Ockham or someone like Ghazali. Those do. Those are, feel like, like attacks from outside, so to speak. But there's plenty of things in the ancient world, like when Proclus is fighting with Philoponus, which are as partisan as you like and as polemical as you like, and things between like Hume and so forth similar. But in this medieval period, from the late Roman world to this High Middle Ages world, anyone who has a well worked out metaphysical thought to contribute on the divine science kind of stuff is taken extremely seriously, right? And no one is dismissing them because they're from a different religion or because they're from a different side of a Aristotelian Platonic divide or any other such campishness, so to speak. There's no tribalism in it. They only care about the arguments. It's quite striking. You also see some of this in the, especially consider the reputation that medieval thought tends to have later, right? About being all dogmatic and doctrinal, and only one thing is acceptable and everything else is, yeah. I was going to say with Suarez, and Gilson does this justice. He talks about in Suarez how he is coming, late in scholasticism, and he's coming in like a judge, and he's going to adjudicate all the cases. He's going to hear everybody out, present the arguments from everybody, and then make a ruling. And Gilson says, sometimes this results in a moderate verdict rather than a just verdict, right? He'll try to reconcile the different positions, and he'll take some position halfway between them. So he will usually give a mostly right ruling, he says, but sometimes he won't, because he's trying so hard not to take a final side. He will not. I think partly that's Gilson saying sometimes he'll rule against me, but it's like he knows the judge is just, but sometimes he doesn't like the verdict anyway. But that procedure was highly developed. It's even more highly developed in Suarez than in someone like Scotus. But it was a typical medieval scholastic procedure. It's the thing which gives them the name of the scholastics, is the fact that they were, they will start off by saying, here is the question, right? Here's a sentence to comment upon, right? And on this, this is what this one of the fathers said, and this is what this one of the doctors says, and this is what the other one of the doctors says. And after you've heard all of them, now let's, give our own take on it, right? And here's my own take on it and how I put it all together, and here's my ruling about who was right, right? And that they're treating it almost like a court case, right? With different parties pleading their case for this is that answer to this philosophical question, and that's something which was made fun of by later philosophers about the scholastics were so procedural, lawyer-like about it. But to me, it's pretty rational. The other end of the spectrum, you can get some things, especially in the Islamic disputes, that got very heated. You notice this in Ghazali in particular. Ghazali and Averroes going at it with the incurrence of the philosophers and the incurrence of the incoherence. If I described Aquinas before, as you read him and he's just extremely clear, and Scotus you're impressed instead with the forcefulness of the reasoning. With Ghazali, you're impressed with the violence of the reasoning, if I can put it this way. He's an extremely powerful thinker, but he's a powerful thinker who is, he wants to force you to make up your mind and take a position so that I can show that you're not agreeing with the faithful Muslims, right? That sort of thing, where he knows that you cannot, you don't want to go along with that conclusion because the thing he's proving against you is also a capital crime. Or he'll need to reach for an example about how causality works, and he'll say, we do not say that the man who puts another man into the fire, that the fire is the agent of his burning. We say the man who put him in the fire is the agent of the burning, right? The fact that that's the example he's reaching for when he's trying to argue against a position as heretical, it's just that's the kind of thing that is you see in Ghazali, and I call that like the violence of the reasoning, right? There's he's serious, right? He means serious business about this. There's an inquisitorial seriousness about Ghazali. Anyway, some of the temperamental things here. Okay, any other questions about that prehistory of Avicenna, or how we got this Neoplatonic theological consensus? Is anyone interested in the any of that stuff? I'm getting 4 people on mute. Has anyone ever read the Theology of Aristotle or the Book of Causes? Go ahead, Joe.
No, actually, the first I've ever heard of these things is the discussions in this group, and by merely mentioning them, that sort of pricks my interest. Not that as a historical curiosity and interest in how do these thoughts sort of progress? What steps do they take, and who thought he defeated whom else, and who comes back and saw it different.
Yes.
Anyway, I like that historical approach. That's why, and I see. So being, as we started off with our challenge to, the historicity of being, we've gone from the walking into the clearing and finding things are real because they now are visible because they're in the clearing instead of back in the woods. But that, okay, so real there is the first occurrence of the word that I'm wondering, what the hell does it mean? And as we keep going, it gets a little more clear. And I'm interested in following this story. But did I grasp it or interpret it, or I could add to it by any thinking of my own? I doubt that yet. Quite a bit yet.
Right. Don't worry about trying to add to it. Just worry about trying to grasp it, I would say. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So does anyone? I think I may have been Gabriel who mentioned before, not being familiar with most of the people in the chapter. How new to people here are each of Avicenna, Scotus, and Suarez? Completely new for all three?
To me, Suarez was completely new. The others I knew a little bit about, but not much.
Yeah,
I've
Suarez
heard
is
you mention Scotus.
Okay, yeah.
And so I've heard of him, but I never heard of Suarez.
Okay. Yeah, so Suarez is interesting in part historically because the notion of scholastic philosophy that Descartes is starting from and reacting to and trying to radically simplify when he first puts pen to paper is basically Suarez. It's the kind of metaphysics and theology that Descartes was taught in school before he came up with his own stuff, right?
I noticed that when I read the next 2 pages beyond the book.
Yes, that's true too. But there are some things in Descartes that go straight back to Augustine, right? But the parts which are more processed, so to speak, that don't go all the way back to Augustine, are going to be starting from Suarez. Suarez wrote an enormous amount. His most compendious thing is just his metaphysical disputations. And it is a standing scandal that there is no good English translation of the metaphysical disputations. You can get pieces of it where there'll be a particular question that someone is interested in. So they lifted out the 60-page passage where Suarez heard all the different disputants on this particular question, and you can find translations of pieces of it like that. And you can find the whole thing in Latin in decent editions. But you cannot find a good translation of the whole of the metaphysical disputations, even in this day and age. And it's striking to me. This is something that in the 1500s, right, was the pinnacle of philosophical learning in the world, so to speak. And 600 years later, less than 600 years later, right, it's not available in translation. It's just surprising. You can get the Book of Causes, though, even though it's way more obscure.
Why do you think Suarez was kind of maybe forgotten or ignored or something like that?
I think it's partisan stuff. I mean, he's in the era of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, especially Counter-Reformation, and he's a Jesuit. He's a Jesuit Spanish, philosopher in the Counter-Reformation, and at a time when everything is partisan. And so none of the Protestant countries want to translate him. Then within Catholic philosophy, it moved on, right? And it moved on, and by the 19th century, it's often Aquinian directions. Between then and the period when he was in favor in Catholicism, Latin was the language of all the learned, and there was no reason to translate him. So people who wanted to read him read him in Latin. There was no need to translate him into the vernacular, right, of different countries. By the time that translation to the vernacular is a common thing, not just for partisan reasons, the Catholic doctrine has moved on to Aquinas, and they're not thinking about Suarez at all anymore. So there's no party that wanted to translate him, basically, in the modern world. the non-Catholics don't want to translate him because he's a Jesuit of the Counter-Reformation, and the modern Catholics want people to think of Aquinas, not a Suarez. So just if someone just want to know the history, they certainly want to read him. But fair question. This is the kind of thing you actually get on him, right? So this is sections from the Metaphysical Disputations on a particular question, right? Formal and universal unity, right? What is unity in a formal sense? What is unity in the sense of universals or ideas? And so, you know, you'll get 120 pages on that, which is, you know, really just, you know, this little piece of the Metaphysical Disputations. And they'll translate that because they care about that question, but they won't try to translate the whole thing. Okay. We want to talk at least a little bit about where we're going next. I mentioned it a little bit before Gabriel got here, but a little bit afterwards. So chapter 4 coming up is going to start with some stuff about Descartes, but honestly, we're going to go through Descartes pretty fast because Gilson's conclusion on Descartes is that he basically just kept Suarez's notions on these questions. He definitely was doing other things besides, but the notion of being and the relationship between being and and essence that you find in Descartes or Spinoza is, according to Gilson, basically just Suarezian essentialism. And I think that's basically fair. In the case of Spinoza, it may also have some more direct dependence on Averroes as well as coming straight through Suarez. And so there may be, you know, a little bit of difference there, but he's mostly a following Descartes, and Spinoza is. But the bulk of the chapter is going to take us. We're going to after that we're going to get to Christian Wolff, and this is setting up Kant. But Christian Wolff is the German philosopher who's like a systematizer and modernizer, who's putting together everything that was left from scholasticism, so to speak, and the modern philosophies of especially all the Cartesians, Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, right? Especially putting all that together with the scholastics and trying to give a kind of course book level compendium of what philosophy thinks about each of these topics. He's also the inventor of the term ontology as it's presently used today, at least. I think there's a few predecessors who used it in a looser sense, but when we say ontology, we're thinking of Christian Wolff's version of ontology. And he is the person that in Kant is just called, he's the stand-in for dogmatic philosophy, whereby Kant has a division of the types of philosophy into there's dogmatic philosophy, which thinks it knows what is in metaphysics. There is skeptical philosophy that thinks that it is not possible to know what is in metaphysics. And there's critical philosophy, which tries to split the difference between them and says there's some things you can know in metaphysics and other things you can't know in metaphysics, right? Which is where he positions himself, right? But from Kant's own positioning, he's trying to present himself as being a mean between two extremes, where one extreme is the dogmatic philosophy of Christian Wolff that thinks you can just know all the metaphysical truths, and the other is the extreme of skepticism in Hume that thinks you can't know the metaphysical truths, or that metaphysics is impossible. So, that's sort of his own positioning. But in that positioning, when he's thinking of dogmatic philosophy, he's not thinking of Plato, he's not thinking of Aristotle, he's not thinking of Platonism in some overarching Nietzschean or Heideggerian sense. He's thinking of Christian Wolff, right? He's thinking of the synthetic school philosophy that's up to date and has included all the advances so far, but is presenting the school position on, and I don't mean the scholastic sense, I mean in the sense of the German university sense on, you know, these questions. So the propounder of that school university sense is Christian Wolff, who's these days mostly known as the predecessor of Kant. Okay, so that's the first big guy we're going to get after Descartes in the chapter, is an explanation of where he is, and it's unsurprisingly going to still be in, you know, lots of continuity with Suarez. And then the sort of meat of the chapter is that Gilson is going to explain how Hume intervenes and all that, and his skepticism makes it hard to see how the order of essences and our understanding of the logical relations of things would have anything to say about existent actuality, right? Skeptical objections to all of that. And from Gilson's point of view, that's a bunch of skeptical existence explosive blowing up essentialism, right? And then Kant is going to, agree with a bunch of that criticism and try to save what he can save, right? Okay, so that is a way the motivation for a lot of this being down on essentialism is Kant's way of saving what can be saved from essentialism is this famous subjective turn that a lot of, yes, it's true that a bunch of our understanding of the causal relationships in things is put there by the understanding, is put there by the mind. It's a projection, not something we're reading off from reality, but it's how we have to project it there because it's how we have to think about the material particulars, right, in the case of the understanding. But by the same token, Kant is going to say that also means that when you're not thinking about material things, your understanding doesn't work. If you don't have a material object to work with, you're not going to think about it right, so to speak. This is the famous stuff in the Critique of Pure Reason, and Kant is going to attack all ontological arguments on that basis. Thinks you cannot derive, existence statements from essential things that are just posited. So you cannot posit an essence and see that there's some fact about existence follows from it and think that that's something you've proven. You haven't proven anything. It was all just something you assumed. Okay, all of that sort of, attack on ontological arguments, attack on rational proofs of the existence of God, the subjective turn in epistemology, all that is what Kant brings in. And Gilson is going to lay all that out as, what happens when the tower of essentialism falls, so to speak, as dogmatic philosophy. And then after that, he's going to cover Hegel and Kierkegaard as further moves in that same tradition. Hegel is a further move in that tradition in the sense of understanding the way in which our projection of the structure of the world is coming from the mind and the requirements of the mind, not just from the things themselves. And then Kierkegaard is going to be reacting to the excessive rationalism of that Hegelianism. With a lance to break for existence in his own way, right, against that essentialism in a way revived by Hegel. So the main characters in the next chapter are really Kant, Hegel, and Kierkegaard, and Christian Wolff is the foil for setting all that up. Hume comes in as the reason why Kant is going to go after essentialism hammer and tongs, right? But in a way, Descartes and Wolff are just set up. They're just continuity with the Suarez beforehand to know why Kant is not attacking Suarez, he's attacking Wolff, right? But then the point of all of that from the standpoint of Gilson's motivation is all of that looks like a necessary consequence of if you come out of medievalism with just this essentialism thing, you're going to run smack into this Copernican turn, this Kantian turn, and you're going to be dropped into the Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard end of the pool, right? And that's your choices are going to be among them, right? He doesn't like the choice among them, right? It's not like he comes out on the Kierkegaard side of that thing. He doesn't like the choice among them. He thinks that we have to. Moderns, he wants to revive the possibility of a metaphysics that has not taken that subjective turn, right? But to do that, he thinks you have to have a version of metaphysics which is not open to the Kantian, Humean, etc. attacks, and that means you have to go back and revisit a bunch of this essentialism that we got in this chapter, and he thinks that the road not taken is the Aquinian road that wouldn't have gone in the direction he thinks that is like set up for Kant to knock down. So that's what we're going to get in the chapter after that is his understanding of the Aquinian position in that, but he's going to give us the problem he thinks it solves before he gives us the his take on the Aquinas position. So one way to think about that is the Aquinas that he wants is not an Aquinas of the 13th century, is an Aquinas of the 19th century. Is an Aquinas that answers problems created by Kant, Hegel, and Kierkegaard. And it fits that that's also when, you know, Aquinas was made the most orthodox position in the Catholic hierarchy, by the Catholic hierarchy, so to speak, was the favorite, you know, philosopher of the 19th century popes. Why? Because, you know, according to Gilson, it has the answers to these conundrums created by Kant to Kierkegaard and the excessive subjectivism of them all, right? So that's where we're sort of really going to see why the motivated version of what Gilson wants out of Aquinas. It's going to be off in chapter 5. But understand, that means that the Aquinas that matters is the Aquinas that answers Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, and the 19th century Aquinas, not just the 13th century Aquinas. Okay, so, but for next chapter, for next time, right, it's just focus on the Kant. What is the problem that Kant is answering? And then beyond that, what about the Hegelian and Kierkegaardian responses to it? Of those, to me, one of the most interesting of that is the Kierkegaard piece of it, just because you might think that Gilson would be enamored of the Kierkegaardian version of it. So seeing to what degree he is and isn't is definitely a useful thing there. Also because in a way you can think of Kierkegaard as a forerunner of modern existentialism in the 20th century sense. So Gilson is someone who is stumping for the importance of existence. So is Kierkegaard, but different ways, I think. Anyway, so we'll get our first look at that when Kierkegaard comes up at the end of the next chapter. Okay. Any other questions about where we're going, so to speak? No.
2 weeks?
Do we want to talk about time? Yes, that's a good question. 2 weeks or 3? That's the question. So 3 weeks would put us at the 24th, which would be the 4th Sunday, which is bad for Craig. Is that right? So 2 works. That's the 17th. Yes?
2 works. It's 50 pages to read. If that's not too much for people to take on, but the 24th doesn't work.
Got it. We'll go for the 17th then. Can definitely do that. So 17th of January, chapter 4, The Rooster Crows at Midnight. Sorry, different book. All right. Any summing up or reactions to this stuff so far and how this is going?
I was very pleased to learn about Suarez, and thank you for pointing out why he was seemingly so obscure to anything I could have encountered before.
Cool. Yeah, he's a fair judge. I don't think he's as brilliant a thinker as some of these other guys, but he's a remarkably fair judge. That's the right way to think about him.
Yeah, I found it very, very fascinating. One thing that kind of struck me again was not being able to see philosophers independent of their own history and independent of the history of the times. There's a lot of almost fear of what God is all about, which would be typical of that era compared to where we are now, where God's almost irrelevant. That intrigued me. Then always been an issue that I had is why can't we take a course of philosophy of a certain time, the history course of a certain time, the art and music of a certain time, and try to integrate it into a better worldview. And I think this was very helpful in that sense of seeing them in the context of their time, what the issues were for them, which may or may not be as important for us now.
I think that's fair. I would also say that to me, it's kind of striking that there's a kind of peak conversation going on for these people, which is less an in time and more on a level kind of thing. It's like people from Philoponus to Suarez across, at least 3 civilizations, and many centuries, because they're talking about sort of weightiest matters of human concern over that giant period of time, are all speaking each other's language, are all reading each other, are all very interested in what each other has to say. And in a way, they're more influenced by each other than by the contemporaries of their century. There are things going on in the contemporaries of their century you have to know about. You have to know about like what's going on with Bishop Tempier, and what's this condemnation of 1277, and what was going around the circle of Al-Kindi in Baghdad in this particular area. You have to know those bits of the history. But the fact that something like the Book of Causes could, start from Proclus and end in, commentaries on it by Aquinas and Duns Scotus, a millennia later, having passed through 3 different civilizations, and still being, taken extremely seriously for the content of the thoughts. It's just striking to me. It's like there's lots of people who don't know that kind of thing happens in history at all. It's not the kind of conventional view we get of we project back ideological camps and divisions that weren't really there, at least at the peak.
But there is a real sense in which, at least in the training I got in so-called Western philosophy, the Islam influence was strikingly absent. And yet, as you bring it in, it's almost critical to see how it interwove within the time frame and the way in which the documents carried forward, not in a direct path, but actually through different languages and different cultures.
Yep. No, I think that's right. I mean, I don't know how much the modern academics don't know it. I know that when I was being taught in school, it was hard to get the students to take anything about the medieval period seriously in the first place, and let alone trace all of these, intricate causal translation, itineraries, so to speak. Because they wanted to get to something modern. They wanted to get to something which was close to what they believed, or whatever. They were looking for more that was less discovery and more continuity with their own experience, so to speak. And some of this stuff just seemed so alien to them that they didn't take it seriously. But it's worth taking seriously. It's remarkably good philosophy, even by modern standards or any standards, in my opinion. Okay, and I'm reminding everybody, one of the reasons we're doing this whole thing is because, Heidegger was telling us that the problem of being had been, not really considered or was forgotten by philosophy, and certainly thought about differently than he's thinking about it. And it may even be true that by the early 20th century, it had been forgotten, at least at this level, in a lot of places, although not by someone like Gilson. But it certainly wasn't the case that no one was thinking about it for those preceding 1,000 years. Okay, yeah. Right. So same time, 2 Sundays from now, and I will put this recording up later tonight. And if you want to see the parts you missed, Gabriel, and we'll do the next one in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.